Tonight we enter the land of Sumer, that ancient and half-drowned world where the first cities rose from the shining mud, where temples stood like mountains against a burning sky, and where human beings first began to press their fears, their debts, their prayers, their kings, and their memories into clay. Tonight we travel to southern Mesopotamia, to a country that no longer exists in the form its people knew it, a country of reed marshes and wandering rivers, of silt islands, date palms, fish traps, black boats, mud brick walls, and wide horizons trembling beneath the heat. Here, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the lands that would one day be called Iraq, something extraordinary happened, something so vast in consequence that every city street, every written contract, every courthouse, every tax office, every school, every law code, every temple, every calendar, every library, and every empire that came after still carries, somewhere deep within its foundations, the ghost of Sumer. And yet the question remains, why did Sumer seem to appear out of nowhere? For generations, archaeologists, historians, and linguists stood before this civilization in a state of wonder. Suddenly, or so it seemed, there were cities. Suddenly there were temples. Suddenly there were kings, scribes, accountants, merchants, priests, armies, long-distance trade networks, mathematical systems, legal formulas, hymns to the gods, laments for fallen cities, and stories of a great flood that swallowed the old world. Suddenly, humanity was writing itself into history. Before Sumer, there were villages, farms, shrines, pottery, stone tools, woven baskets, figurines, and scattered signs of complexity. But in Sumer, the tempo quickened, the scale changed. The human imagination appeared to gather itself into brick and ritual and bureaucracy. The scattered pulses of prehistoric life became something concentrated, something deliberate, something almost terrifying in its ambition. In the ancient texts, the Sumerians did not describe civilization as a slow accident. They didn't imagine the city as merely a response to hunger, irrigation, or trade. To them, civilization had descended. Kingship had come down from heaven. The gods had chosen cities. The temple was not simply a building. It was the axis of the world. The priest was not merely a ritual specialist. He stood near the dangerous border between mortals and divine power. The ruler was not merely a strong man. He was the shepherd of a people who believed the cosmos itself had to be ordered, fed, sung to, measured, and maintained. This is what makes Sumer so haunting. The oldest written voices in human history do not speak first of curiosity alone. They speak of obligation. They speak of offerings, rations, fields, herds, canals, labour, beer, barley, wool, and gods. They speak of a world in which the sacred and the practical were not separate realms, but a single living system. Clay tablets tell of grain moving into temple storehouses, of workers receiving measured portions, of animals counted, of land assessed, of silver weighed, of names recorded so that nothing, not even a small jar of oil, could vanish without memory. But beneath these lists there is something deeper. There's fear. Fear of flood, fear of drought, fear of famine, fear of the river changing its course, fear of the gods withdrawing favour, fear that chaos, always waiting at the edge of the field, might return and swallow everything that had been built. To stand in Sumer was to stand in a fragile world. The land was fertile, but only if managed with relentless care. Water brought life, but water could also destroy. Silt renewed the fields, but canals clogged and shifted. The marshes fed people, but also hid danger. The sun ripened grain, but could scorch the earth to dust. In such a landscape, cooperation was not a luxury. It was survival. Measurement was not abstract. It was life and death. Authority was not merely political. It was woven into the task of holding the world together. And so the clay tablets matter. They do not merely tell us what Sumerians believed. They reveal the bones of a civilization learning to think at scale. They reveal a society that transformed memory into marks, sound into signs, obligation into records, and myth into architecture. They reveal that Sumer did not simply appear. It emerged from a long, deep, and complex world. But when it crossed a certain threshold, it became visible in a way no society had ever been visible before. Writing creates suddenness. A people without texts may live richly for thousands of years, building, farming, singing, burying their dead, naming the stars, telling stories around hearth fires, shaping wood and reed and clay with skill beyond our imagining. But unless those lives are preserved, the past becomes a dim field of fragments, a broken pot, a hearth stain, a post hole, a burial, a carved seal, a wall foundation. The moment writing begins, the ancient world appears to speak, and we mistake that first surviving voice for a beginning. Sumer's sudden arrival, then is partly an illusion created by preservation. A civilization long forming in silence entered history when its people invented a way for clay to remember. Still, the mystery is not erased. It becomes sharper. Why here? Why then? Why did these marshland communities develop the first true cities? Why did the temple become the engine of administration? Why did accounting precede literature? Why did the earliest writing concern grain and labour before it carried epics and hymns? Why did later Sumerian scribes insist that their world had been shaped by gods, flood survivors, ancient kings, and wisdom from a time almost beyond imagining? These questions pull us into the deep places. They carry us beneath the ruins of Uruk, beneath the sacred mound of Eridu, beneath the later legends of kings who ruled for impossible spans of time, beneath the grand ziggurats that rose like artificial mountains from the alluvial plain. They carry us into the work of stratigraphic excavation, where archaeologists read the earth layer by layer, where broken pottery becomes a calendar, where ash, brick, bone, bitumen, reed impressions, and temple platforms reveal the slow accumulation of human ambition. They carry us into radiocarbon dating, into lithic analysis, into environmental reconstruction, into the study of ancient river channels and buried canals. They carry us toward genomic data, toward language isolates, toward the unresolved identity of the Sumerians themselves. For the Sumerian language is another door into the unknown. It does not belong neatly to the Semitic tongues spoken by many of their neighbours. It does not sit comfortably inside the major language families known today. It stands apart, strange and enduring, preserved in schools and temples long after everyday political power had passed to others. A language of hymns, laments, royal inscriptions, myths, administrative lists, mathematical exercises, and incantations. A language that became sacred even when Sumer itself was no longer independent. It is tempting, when faced with such strangeness, to imagine invasion, a lost people arriving from mountains or sea, a sudden migration into the marshes, a civilizing race stepping onto the stage of history fully formed. But archaeology is rarely so simple. The earth resists easy stories. The deeper layers speak of continuity as much as rupture. Beneath Sumer lie older cultures, older villages, older temples, older patterns of ritual and exchange. The Sumerian miracle was not a lightning strike from an empty sky. It was the result of long preparation, environmental pressure, social experiment, religious imagination, and administrative necessity. It was slow in formation, sudden in visibility, and immense in consequence. That is the true drama, not that Sumer came from nowhere, but that it came from somewhere so deep, so mud-covered, so layered with forgotten human choices, that for a long time we could not see the road that led there, and perhaps the Sumerians themselves understood this better than anyone. Their myths are filled with beginnings that are not beginnings, cities founded by gods, kings before the flood, wisdom carried across catastrophe, order wrestled from chaos, humans fashioned for service, civilization received as a burden as much as a blessing. They remembered the world as something fragile, bestowed, threatened, and renewed. They did not see themselves as primitive ancestors stumbling blindly toward us. They saw themselves as dwellers in a cosmos alive with intention, danger, ceremony, and law. And so tonight, before the tablets and before the ruins, before the names of kings and gods, we must first set aside the old arrogance. These people were not children at the dawn of thought. They were our equals in fear, in wonder, in grief, in calculation, in ambition, and in the hunger to be remembered. They watched the same moon rise above their cities. They listened to the same night winds moving through reeds. They buried their dead with trembling hands. They counted grain because children had to eat. They praised gods because the world was uncertain. They built temples because meaning required shape. They invented writing because memory alone was no longer enough. From the mud of Sumer came the first great experiment in urban life. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The tablets speak, but not completely. The ruins rise, but in fragments. The rivers that gave life have changed their courses. The marshes have retreated and returned. The oldest stories have reached us through copies made centuries after their first telling. The first scribes are nameless. The first city planners are dust. The first priests who climb the temple platforms at dawn are gone beyond all recovery. Yet something of them remains, in clay, in brick, in the measured line of a canal, in the shadow of a ziggurat, in a sign pressed by a reed stylus 5,000 years ago, when a human hand decided that a thought should outlive the body. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin this long descent into the world of Sumer, post your location and your local time below, somewhere tonight, perhaps in a city of glass and steel, perhaps beside a river, perhaps under desert stars. You are listening to the first voice of history rise once more from the clay. To understand Sumer, one must first imagine the land not as a fixed country, not as a kingdom with borders drawn upon a map, but as a restless meeting place between earth and water. Southern Mesopotamia was never still. It was made by rivers, unmade by rivers, and made again. The Tigris and the Euphrates carried their heavy burden of silt down from distant highlands, laying it across the flat southern plain in slow gifts of brown and gold. Season after season, flood after flood. The land grew outward, a soft world of mud banks, reed thickets, marsh pools, levees, lagoons, and shimmering channels. It was not the easiest place for a civilization to begin. It was not a paradise waiting patiently for farmers. It was a place of abundance and danger mixed together so closely that no person could ever fully separate them. The sky was vast here, the horizon almost without interruption. In summer, the heat pressed down like a weight. In winter, cold winds moved over the plain and stirred the reeds into whispers. Birds gathered in great numbers across the marshes. Fish moved through the canals and backwaters. Wild pigs rooted in the mud. Date palms rose along the settlements, their crowns trembling above houses built from clay, reed, and memory. This was a world where stone was rare. Timber was scarce. Metal had to be acquired from elsewhere. Everything solid had to be invented out of what the land provided. Mud became brick. Reeds became mats, roofs, boats, baskets, fences, and walls. Bitumen, black and sticky, sealed vessels and strengthened boats. Clay became bowls, jars, tablets, tokens, and eventually the surface upon which history itself would be written. The people of Sumer were not surrounded by grand forests or mountains of building stone. Their genius grew from adaptation. They learned to make permanence out of impermanence. And there, in this watery southern world, cities began to rise. Eridu, ancient and sacred, stood near the edge of the marshes, remembered by later tradition as one of the first cities and as a dwelling place of divine wisdom. later famous for its royal tombs and great temple tower, emerged as a powerful centre near routes of trade and water traffic. Uruk grew into something almost unprecedented, a vast urban organism of temples, workshops, streets, courtyards, storehouses, and walls, a place where thousands upon thousands of lives became entangled in a single system. But these cities did not stand alone like lonely monuments in an empty plain. They were connected to a landscape of villages, farms, pasture zones, fishing grounds, canals, and sacred sites. Water was the thread that bound them together. Boats could move where carts could not. A reed boat sliding along a canal might carry barley, wool, fish, pottery, timber, copper, or people. Messages moved by water, offerings moved by water, labourers moved by water. The rivers were roads, but roads with minds of their own. A canal could feed a city. A canal could also silt up and fail. A channel that brought fertility to one district might abandon another. A flood could renew fields or tear through homes and walls. Irrigation allowed agriculture on a scale that could support dense populations. But irrigation demanded cooperation, maintenance, measurement, and authority. Someone had to organise labour. Someone had to decide when canals were cleared. Someone had to measure fields, settle disputes, store grain, distribute rations, and protect the delicate machinery of survival. In such a world, administration was not an ornament added to society once people became wealthy. It was part of the struggle to remain alive. The marshes offered fish, birds, reeds, and grazing. The fields offered barley, flax, sesame, legumes, and dates. The herds gave wool, milk, meat, and status. Yet abundance could vanish quickly. Too much water, too little water, salt collecting in the soil, pests in the fields, conflict over canals, disease among animals, disruption of trade. All of these could bring hardship. The Sumerian city grew from this tension between plenty and threat. The temple stood at the centre because the centre had to hold. A temple was not simply a sanctuary for private devotion. It was a storehouse, an employer, a landholder, a ritual machine, and a symbol of cosmic balance. Its raised platforms lifted sacred space above the flatness of the plain. Its courtyards gathered offerings and workers. Its officials counted grain, livestock, cloth, and labour. Its ceremonies reassured the community that human order still answered to divine order, in a land where the river might betray you, where the sky might withhold rain far upstream, where the soil itself could turn bitter with salt. Ritual and administration became two faces of the same need. The earlier cities were built of mud brick, and this matters. Mud brick decays, it collapses, it melts back into the earth under rain and time. A wall built by one generation becomes a mound beneath the feet of the next. Houses are rebuilt on their own ruins. Temples are enlarged, levelled, rebuilt, and raised again. Over centuries, these accumulated remains form tells, the great archaeological mounds of the Near East. A tell is not a natural hill. It is human life piled upon itself. It is breakfast fires, broken bowls, fallen roofs, temple platforms, burial pits, refuse, floors, repairs, and abandonments compressed into a single rising shape. To excavate such a mound is to move downward through time. Each layer is a vanished surface where people once stood. Each floor was once someone's present. Stratigraphic excavation reads these layers like pages, though many pages are torn, burned, reused, or missing. Pottery changes, bricks change, tools change, seals change, diet changes, burial practices change. The archaeologist does not uncover Sumer as a single event, but as a stack of decisions made across centuries. The land itself kept changing as well. The coastline of the Gulf lay farther north in remote antiquity than it does today. River mouths shifted. Marshes expanded and contracted. Settlements that once stood near navigable waters later found themselves stranded. Others prospered because a canal or channel favoured them. Sumerian history cannot be separated from this unstable geography. The cities were not merely built on land, they were negotiations with water. Imagine the morning in one of these early settlements. The first light touches the reeds, smoke rises from ovens, dogs move between doorways, women grind grain, children carry small vessels. A fisherman returns with his catch. A scribe or temple official receives deliveries near a storage room. Workers gather for canal maintenance. A potter kneads clay. A shepherd counts animals before moving them toward grazing. Somewhere above the ordinary noise of the city, priests prepare offerings, perhaps bread, beer, dates, fish, oil, or incense, presented not as symbolic decoration, but as necessary acts in the maintenance of the world. The city breathes through labour. It is not yet the marble imagination of later empires. It is mud, sweat, reed fibre, fish scales, barley dust, animal dung, smoke, wet clay, and sun-baked brick. Its power lies not in shining stone, but in coordination. It takes the small acts of thousands of people and binds them into something larger than a village, larger than a clan, larger than memory alone could govern. This is why the landscape of Sumer cannot be treated as a backdrop. It was an active force in the making of civilization. The rivers demanded planning. The marshes offered refuge and food. The absence of local stone forced innovation in clay. The scarcity of timber and metal encouraged exchange with distant lands. The flatness of the plain made temples into mountains. The instability of water made authority meaningful. The fragility of mud brick made rebuilding a sacred habit. And all across this land, from reed hut to temple precinct, from fish trap to grain field, from canal bank to city wall, people lived with an awareness that their world had to be continually remade. The Sumerians did not rise from an empty stage. They rose from mud, water, labour, and longing. They rose from a landscape that offered no easy permanence. And perhaps that is why they became so determined to create forms that endured. Cities, temples, lists, laws, myths, names, tablets, foundations, sacred memories. In the marshes, the world was always dissolving. In clay, they found a way to make it stay. The great puzzle of Sumer has always been the feeling that it arrived too quickly. One moment, at least in the old imagination, the southern Mesopotamian plain seemed to belong to scattered farming villages, reed huts, local shrines, and small communities struggling with mud, water, and harvest. Then, almost without warning, the archaeological record seemed to open like a door, and there stood Uruk, vast and complex, with monumental temple precincts, administrative buildings, thousands of workers, craft specialists, long-distance trade, cylinder seals, numerical tablets, beveled rim bowls, and the first unmistakable signs of writing. To the early excavators, this was astonishing. They were trained to seek origins in slow visible stages, to watch complexity rise like a staircase. Yet in southern Mesopotamia the staircase seemed partly buried, partly broken, partly missing. The first great cities did not present themselves gently. They appeared already heavy with institutions, already filled with offices, workshops, storerooms, rituals, and accountants, already capable of organising labour on a scale that demanded planning far beyond the village, already speaking through clay signs that had no true ancestor in the written record. Because writing itself was the new phenomenon. This is why Sumer looked like a miracle. Not a miracle in the simple sense of something without cause, but a miracle in the deeper historical sense of an event whose roots were hidden from view. Archaeology could see the flower before it could fully trace the seed. The temples were there, the tablets were there, the walls were there, the mass production was there, the cities were there. But the exact pathway by which the earlier world became this new one remained difficult to follow. Part of the difficulty lay in the material itself. Sumer was built from mud brick, and mud brick is a poor servant of easy history. It collapses into itself. It erodes. It is reused, levelled, trampled, and rebuilt. A great wall becomes a smear of clay. A room becomes a stain. A temple rebuilt 10 times may hide its earliest form beneath tons of later devotion. In a land where people returned to the same sacred places for centuries, the oldest traces were often crushed beneath the weight of reverence. Then there is the matter of water. The rivers shifted, destroyed, buried, nourished, and concealed. Sites vanished beneath silt. Ancient channels moved away from cities. Marshes expanded over settlements. Floods erased surfaces that might have preserved crucial evidence. What appears sudden in excavation may partly be the result of an archive damaged by the very landscape that made civilization possible. Yet even when allowances are made, the transformation remains remarkable. By the late 4th millennium BC, the Uruk world had become something new. Human settlement in southern Mesopotamia was no longer merely larger, it was structurally different. The city had become an instrument. It gathered people, resources, animals, fields, workshops, ceremonies, and authority into a single dense organism. It created new forms of dependence. A potter could spend more time making vessels because others produced food. A scribe could count grain because others harvested it. A priest could perform rituals because others maintained the temple economy. A labourer could receive rations because an institution controlled surplus. This is the hidden revolution. Sumer did not appear suddenly because people became smarter overnight. It appeared suddenly because society crossed a threshold at which old habits of memory, kinship, and local exchange were no longer enough. The city required systems. Systems required records. Records required signs. Signs required trained specialists. Specialists required institutions. Institutions required legitimacy. Legitimacy required stories powerful enough to persuade human beings that their labour belonged to something greater than themselves. Here, myth and bureaucracy met. That meeting may seem strange to modern eyes. We often separate the sacred from the administrative, as if temples belong to belief and tablets belong to accounting. But in the earlier cities, the division dissolves. Grain was counted because it fed workers, but also because grain belonged within a sacred economy. Land was measured because harvest had to be managed, but land was also bound to divine households. Labour was organised because canals and temples required bodies, but labour could be framed as service within a cosmic order. The city did not only solve practical problems, it explained them. It gave hardship meaning. It turned obligation into ritual. It transformed storage into offering, hierarchy into divine arrangement, and collective work into the maintenance of the world. In this sense, the rise of Sumer challenges one of the simplest stories ever told about civilization. The idea that people first farmed, then settled, then grew wealthy, then built temples once they had spare time for religion. The Sumerian evidence suggests something more entangled. Ritual did not merely decorate society, it organised it. Sacred centres may have helped gather labour, store resources, define leadership, and create shared identity across communities that could no longer rely only on blood ties. The temple was not a late luxury. It was one of the engines by which scale became possible. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The earlier Sumerian texts do not give us a historian's explanation of how their civilization formed. They do not say, in clear language, "Here is why our cities emerged. Here is when our ancestors arrived. Here is how villages became states." Instead, they speak through lists, offerings, rations, titles, myths, hymns, divine names, and royal memory. They preserve the world as the Sumerians understood it, not as a modern archaeologist would arrange it. And what they understood was profound. They saw civilization as something received, guarded, and always at risk. They imagined a time before cities, then a moment when kingship descended. They remembered a flood, not merely as weather, but as cosmic rupture. They placed divine powers at the foundation of urban life. Their texts suggest that the city was not an accident of population density, but a sacred fact, a human settlement made meaningful because it mirrored heaven's order on earth. Modern excavation offers another kind of truth. Pottery sequences show gradual change. Architectural phases show growth over time. Administrative tokens and sealings suggest earlier systems of counting before full writing. Settlement surveys reveal networks of smaller communities feeding into larger centres. Lithic analysis, ceramic study, paleo-environmental reconstruction, and radiocarbon dating all point away from a single instant of origin. Beneath the apparent suddenness lies a long accumulation of experiment, yet the old shock remains because thresholds matter. Water heated slowly still boils at a point. A child learning words suddenly speaks in sentences. A village world can change through centuries of small adjustments, and then one day the result becomes a city, something qualitatively different from everything that came before. That is what Sumer represents. Not beginning from nothing, but the moment human society became visible to itself at a new scale. The clay tablets reveal this more clearly than any monument. Their earliest signs are not poetry. They are not philosophy. They are not heroic songs. They are accounts, numbers, commodities, measures, names, categories. They show a mind of administration forming in clay, but this does not make them spiritually empty. Quite the opposite. Behind every ration list is an institution. Behind every institution is authority. Behind authority is belief. Behind belief is the human terror of disorder. The people of Sumer knew that grain could rot, rivers could fail, workers could flee, fields could salt, enemies could come, gods could rage, and memory could disappear. The city was their answer, not a perfect answer, not a gentle answer, but a mighty one. So when we ask why Sumer suddenly appeared, we are really asking how deep time becomes history. We are asking why scattered lives became organized into streets, temples, offices, and records. We are asking why clay began to speak. We are asking why human beings accepted the burdens of the city in exchange for its protections, its meanings, its food, its gods, and its promise of endurance. The answer is not one cause. It is not simply irrigation, not simply trade, not simply conquest, not simply migration, not simply religion. It is all these forces drawn together in the pressure chamber of the alluvial plain until something ancient and new at once emerge from the mud. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we stand before the earlier cities and feel the distance between evidence and wonder. Sumer did not come from nowhere. It came from a place we are still learning how to see. The first great voices of Sumer did not come from golden tombs, towering walls, or the mouths of kings. They came from clay, small pieces of clay, broken pieces, fired by accident or preserved by burial. Tablets no larger than a human palm, impressed with marks that once looked to modern eyes like scratches, wedges, bird tracks, or the secret signs of a vanished priesthood. For thousands of years they lay beneath dust, brick fall, flood silt, and the ruins of cities whose names had become little more than shadows. Men and women had lived, calculated, argued, worshipped, feared, and died. Their homes collapsed, their temples cracked, their languages vanished from the living tongue. Yet the clay remained. And clay, unlike memory, does not easily betray the dead. When early explorers and excavators began to pull these tablets from the earth, they were not immediately greeted by a clear story. There was no grand opening sentence, no ancient narrator rising from the dark to explain the birth of civilization. Instead, there were fragments, lists, receipts, signs, numbers, names, accounts of grain, sheep, beer, cloth, fields, labourers, and offerings. The archive of Sumer didn't first announce itself as epic. It announced itself as administration. This is one of the most humbling truths in the history of writing. The first preserved written world is not a world of philosophers setting down abstract principles. It is not a world of poets carefully composing for distant descendants. It is a world trying to keep track, to remember who owed what, to count what had entered the storehouse, to measure what had left it, to bind the flow of goods and labour to a durable surface, to make obligation visible. The reed stylus entered soft clay, and suddenly memory had weight. One can imagine the hand at work, the tablet shaped from damp clay, the surface smoothed, the signs pressed in quickly before it dried, the scribe, perhaps still more accountant than author, choosing from a developing system of marks that had not yet become the full-flowing script known from later centuries. There were signs for commodities, numbers, measures, institutions, perhaps names and offices. The act was practical, yes, but also revolutionary. A human thought had crossed into matter. At first, writing did not need to record every sound of speech. It did not need to capture a complete sentence as one might speak it aloud. It could function through symbols, numerical systems, and conventional signs understood by trained people inside a specific administrative world. The tablet was not always meant for eternity. It was meant for a storeroom, a transaction, a shipment, a record, a check against forgetting. And yet eternity took it. The clay tablets survived where voices did not. They outlasted kings who may have believed themselves immortal. They outlasted buildings raised with ceremony and sealed with offerings. They outlasted the scribes who pressed them, the workers whose rations they recorded, the animals they counted, the fields they measured, and the gods in whose houses they may have been stored. Because of them, the silence of prehistory thinned, and the first documentary light entered the human story. But decipherment was not simple. The signs had to be recognized as writing. Their values had to be reconstructed. Languages had to be separated from one another. Sumerian, Akkadian, and later scribal traditions lay tangled together across centuries of use and reuse. Some tablets were written long after Sumerian had ceased to be a common spoken language, preserved in schools as a language of learning, ritual, scholarship, and cultural prestige. The clay archive was therefore not a single voice, but a chorus across time, slowly, through comparison. Bilingual texts, sign lists, royal inscriptions, school exercises, and the patient work of scholars. The tablets began to speak. They revealed a civilization obsessed with classification, lists of professions, lists of animals, lists of vessels, lists of cities, lists of gods, lists of words. The Sumerian scribal mind did not merely write the world, it sorted it. It arranged reality into categories, as if order could be made stronger by being named and repeated. The school was not only a place of literacy, it was a training ground in how to see the universe through controlled signs. There were also hymns, there were laments, there were myths of gods, creation, kingship, flood, descent, wisdom, rivalry, and divine power. There were stories in which cities had personalities, temples had cosmic significance, and human life unfolded beneath forces immense and unpredictable. These texts reveal not only what Sumerians did, but what they feared and hoped and imagined. They show us a people who did not separate the counting of grain from the favour of the gods, nor the building of cities from the architecture of the cosmos. The tablets are therefore dangerous evidence. They tempt us to believe we understand more than we do. A written line feels intimate. A name pressed into clay feels like a hand reaching across millennia. Yet every text comes from a context. Who wrote it? Who authorized it? Was it a school copy, a temple record, a royal boast, a legal transaction, a ritual composition? A myth copied centuries after its first form. Was it meant to preserve truth, train memory, display power? or maintain tradition. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The tablets reveal much, but they also conceal. They preserve official concerns more easily than private whispers. They remember storehouses better than heartbreak. They record rations better than songs sung by mothers to children in reed houses at dusk. They name gods and kings, but leave countless ordinary lives unnamed. The written record is not the whole of Sumer. It is a window, brilliant but narrow. Even so, through that window the sudden appearance of Sumer begins to look different. The texts reveal that civilization was not merely a collection of buildings, it was an information system. The city needed memory beyond the mind. It needed records that could be checked, stored, copied, and transmitted. Once communities grew large enough, once temples commanded enough labour, once goods flowed from field to storehouse to workshop to worker, human memory alone could not hold the pattern. Writing emerged not as decoration, but as infrastructure. This is why the clay tablets matter more than treasure. Gold tells us that wealth existed. Weapons tell us that violence existed. Palaces tell us that power existed. But tablets tell us how power moved, how wealth was counted, how institutions endured beyond the lifespan of individuals. They show civilization in operation. The pulse beneath the monument, the mechanism behind the myth. A temple could command 1,000 workers only if someone knew who they were, what they received, what they produced, and what they owed. A field could belong to an institution only if its boundaries and yields were remembered. A trade network could stretch across mountains and seas only if goods were measured and obligations tracked. A ruler could claim greatness, but a bureaucracy made greatness usable. And yet, even in the dry language of accounts, one can feel the human presence. A ration tablet means hunger answered, or hunger controlled. A labour list means bodies gathered under authority. A livestock account means animals breathing in pens, counted by type, age, and value. A beer distribution record means grain transformed, workers sustained, festivals supplied, gods honoured. Behind each sign is movement, behind each number is a day in someone's life. The tablets beneath the dust did not reveal that Sumer came from nowhere. They revealed that Sumer became visible when society learned to record itself. They showed that the birth of history was not a trumpet blast, but a hand pressing a reed into wet clay. Quiet, repetitive, administrative, almost humble. Yet from that humble act came literature, law, astronomy, mathematics, scholarship, theology, and the long-written memory of humankind. A mark was made, a debt endured, a name survived, a city began to speak, and from beneath the dust, across 5,000 years of silence, Sumer still speaks. Among the strangest documents ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia is a list of kings. At first glance, it seems almost simple. A sequence of cities, a sequence of rulers, a sequence of reigns. Names arranged in order, one after another, as though the ancient scribes were trying to make history stand upright, to give political memory a spine. Kingship belongs here, then it moves there. One city rises, another city receives the crown. Power passes from hand to hand, from temple city to temple city, across the long plain between the rivers. But then the numbers appear. The first kings do not reign for 20 years, or 40 years, or even 100. They reign for thousands. Some rule for spans of time so vast that they seem less like men than constellations. A reign of 28,800 years, another of 36,000, another of 43,200. These are not normal kings. These are not ordinary dynasties preserved by careful court historians. They belong to a world where memory and myth have fused, where political authority reaches backward into a sacred past almost too deep for human thought. And then comes the flood. The list tells of kingship before the flood, and kingship after the flood. It divides time itself with catastrophe. Before the waters, reigns are immense, impossible, almost cosmic. After the waters, The numbers shrink, though they remain grand. The world has changed. Humanity has survived. But something older has been broken. The flood is not merely a disaster. It is a hinge in the structure of memory. This is why the Sumerian king list is not only a political record, it is a map of how civilization imagined its own beginning. The text insists that kingship descended from heaven. It did not grow naturally from village quarrels, irrigation schedules, or ambitious households. It came down. It was bestowed. It belonged first to one city, then another, as if sovereignty were a sacred object carried across the land by forces beyond human choosing. A city became great not simply because it had walls, fields, troops, or wealth, but because kingship had settled there. That idea matters. In the Sumerian imagination, rule was not merely force, it required cosmic permission. A king might command workers, build walls, dig canals, defeat enemies, and dedicate temples. But his authority still stood beneath the gods. Power had to be explained as more than domination. It had to belong to the order of the universe. Without that explanation, kingship was only violence wearing a crown. The early names in the list drift between history and dream. Some are attached to cities known from archaeology. Some are linked to traditions that echo through later myths. Some appear like fragments of an older world half remembered and half invented. The list does not behave like a modern chronicle. It compresses, expands, arranges, selects, and sanctifies. It makes rival city traditions part of one grand sequence. It turns a landscape of competing powers into a single story about the movement of kingship through time. That is not a flaw. It is the purpose. The scribes who copied and preserved such traditions were not writing history as we write it. They were giving political reality a sacred ancestry. They were saying that the cities of Sumer did not stand alone in confusion, each shouting its own glory into the dust. They belonged to a chain. Their rulers participated in an order older than any single dynasty. Their conflicts were woven into a larger pattern, even when that pattern could only be expressed through impossible numbers and ancient catastrophe. The impossible reigns of long-troubled scholars. Were they symbolic? Were they based on old numerical systems whose meanings are now obscure? Were they designed to express divine favour, cosmic antiquity, or the almost superhuman stature of primeval rulers? Did they preserve distant memories of ancestral chiefs magnified across time by oral tradition? Or were they literary devices, deliberate signs that the age before the flood belonged to a different order of existence? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Yet even without final answers, the king list reveals something profound about Sumerian thought. It shows that the Sumerians did not imagine history as a flat sequence of events. They imagined it as sacred movement. Time had structure. Cities had destinies. Catastrophe divided ages. Kingship could descend, depart, and descend again. Political power was not merely local. It belonged to a cosmic drama in which divine decision, human rule, and urban life were inseparable. This idea helps explain why Sumer seems so sudden. The Sumerians themselves remembered civilization not as a slow accident, but as a gift. Their texts speak as though the essential institutions of ordered life had been granted to humanity from beyond. Kingship came down from heaven. Cities were chosen, temples were founded. Wisdom belonged to gods and ancient sages. The world of canals, storehouses, walls, rituals, and laws was not merely built, it was received. Modern archaeology tells a slower story, made of mud brick phases, ceramic sequences, settlement surveys, radiocarbon dating, and stratigraphic excavation. Yet the ancient texts tell us how the people inside that world understood themselves. They did not see their cities as temporary camps swollen by grain. They saw them as sacred containers of order. They did not see kingship as merely practical command. They saw it as a force that had entered the world, and at the centre of this memory stands the flood. Across Mesopotamian tradition, flood stories return again and again. A world destroyed, a chosen survivor, a vessel, animals preserved, divine anger, divine regret, a new beginning. These stories are not all identical, but their persistence suggests that flood was more than mythic ornament. In a riverland where inundation could bring both fertility and devastation, the memory of overwhelming water carried enormous power. Perhaps it reflects real flood events magnified by tradition. Perhaps it expresses the existential danger of living in a low alluvial world. Perhaps it became the perfect symbol for the collapse of one age and the birth of another. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we stand before the text and feel its double nature. It is not simple history. It is not simple fiction. It is royal ideology, sacred memory, political theology, numerical mystery, and ancestral myth bound together in clay. The king list gives Sumer a past longer than ordinary time. It roots its city-states in an age when human beings lived closer to the divine, when rulers were immense, when the flood had not yet washed the world clean. By doing so, it transforms the first cities into heirs of something older than themselves. It says that civilization did not begin with the first visible walls. It began in a sacred order that existed before remembered history. What did ordinary listeners hear when such names were recited? Perhaps they heard reassurance. Their city belonged to a story. Their king stood in a line descending from heaven. Their labour in fields and canals served an order older than their own suffering. Perhaps they heard warning as well. Kingship could move. The gods could withdraw favour. Flood could come. Cities that seemed eternal could fall silent beneath dust. This is the terror hidden inside the list. No city owns destiny forever. The crown passes. The divine gift relocates. One sacred centre rises, then another. Even the greatest kings are carried away by time. The list preserves authority, but it also remembers instability. It gives structure to power, yet admits that power is never safe. And so the Sumerian king list stands as one of the great monuments of the ancient mind, not because every number can be read as fact, not because every ruler can be placed securely in excavated history, but because it shows us a civilization trying to understand its own emergence, trying to bind mud brick cities to heaven, trying to place catastrophe within order, trying to make kingship older than memory and therefore stronger than doubt. The kings before history remain distant. Their names flicker at the edge of knowledge. Their reigns stretch beyond belief. Their cities are both real and legendary, both archaeological and cosmic. We cannot walk their streets with certainty. We cannot hear their original songs. We cannot know exactly when memory ended and myth began. Still, the clay preserves the claim. Once kingship descended from heaven. Once the first cities held the divine burden of rule. Once, before the flood, human beings imagined their past not as darkness, but as a world of immense rulers, sacred foundations, and powers moving through time like stars across the night. At Eridu, the earth remembers in layers, not in the clear speech of a single tablet, not in the proud voice of a king announcing his conquests, but in the slow, stacked silence of floors, bricks, ash, plaster, walls, offerings, and rebuilding. Here, near the southern edge of the old Mesopotamian world, where marsh and plain once met beneath a burning sky, archaeology descends into one of the most sacred places ever known to the Sumerians. Eridu was not merely a city, it was an origin point. Later tradition honoured it as among the oldest of all urban foundations, a place where divine wisdom entered the human world, a place associated with deep water, sacred knowledge, and the mysterious power that allowed civilization to take shape. Its importance did not depend only on political strength. Eridu's power was older, quieter, and more haunting. It was the authority of beginnings. When excavators cut into the mound, they did not find a single temple standing whole and untouched. They found something stranger and more valuable. They found temple built upon temple, shrine upon shrine, sacred architecture renewed again and again across generations. Each new building rose over the bones of the last. Walls were levelled, Platforms were enlarged, plans were altered. The sacred place remained, even as its form changed. This is what makes Eridu so important. It shows that religion did not simply appear as decoration once the city had already become powerful. Ritual architecture had deep roots, long before imperial palaces and famous law codes, long before later kings covered the land with inscriptions. People were already gathering around a sacred centre and rebuilding it with care. The act of rebuilding itself became a kind of memory. The temple did not die when its walls collapsed. It was reborn on the same spot, lifted slightly higher by the remains of devotion. Stratigraphic excavation at Eridu revealed this sequence with extraordinary force. Layer by layer, the mound disclosed a long history of sacred continuity. The earliest levels contained modest structures, small in scale compared with the later monumental temples of Sumerian cities, yet already set apart by their plan, placement, and repeated renewal. Over time, the buildings grew more elaborate. Rooms became more formal. Platforms rose higher. Architectural attention became more intense. The shrine became a temple. The temple became an institution. The institution became a memory so powerful that later generations looked back and saw the hand of the divine. To stand mentally within one of those early structures is to feel how little is required for a place to become holy. A prepared floor, a raised platform, a niche, a hearth, a table for offerings, a space entered with intention. Perhaps fish, grain, bread, dates, oil, or small vessels were placed there. Perhaps smoke rose from burning substances. Perhaps words were spoken that left no mark in the archaeological record. Perhaps the people who entered did not yet belong to anything we would call a state, but they already understood that certain places mattered more than others. The temple gathered attention. Attention gathered people. People gathered memory. Memory gathered power. This is the quiet revolution of Eridu. No army is needed to explain its earliest significance. No palace, no throne room, no royal tomb glittering with weapons and gold. Instead, the evidence points toward a sacred focus around which social life could grow. The temple gave the community a centre that was not merely practical. It gave them a point where the human and the unseen met, where offerings could be made, where obligation could be enacted, where continuity could be physically built into the earth. In later Sumerian thought, Eridu was connected with the god of wisdom and subterranean waters, a figure of depth, craft, and ordering intelligence. Whether every detail of later myth can be projected back into the earliest levels is uncertain. Archaeology demands caution. Myth is not a photograph, but the association is suggestive. Eridu stood in a wet world, near marshes and channels, close to the life-giving but dangerous powers of water. It is not difficult to understand why sacred imagination might settle there. Water was never only water. It was fertility, transport, purification, danger, boundary, and mystery. It rose from below. It fell from above. It moved through canals and flooded fields. It could bring fish and reeds, or swallow land. In a landscape where survival depended upon controlling and appeasing forces larger than any one household, a temple linked to water and wisdom would have carried immense symbolic weight. Eridu teaches that the Sumerian city was born not only from economics, but from orientation. People needed to know where they stood in the world. They needed a centre. They needed ceremonies that said the world could still be ordered. They needed architecture that made the invisible durable. A mud brick shrine might seem humble beside later towers, but in that humble form was the seed of something vast. Mud brick is fragile, but repeated mud brick is powerful. Every rebuilding says, this place remains. Every new floor laid over an old one says, the past is beneath our feet. Every enlarged platform says, the sacred must rise higher. Over time, this accumulation turned devotion into topography. The mound itself became a human-made hill, a monument not of one king's ambition, but of generations returning to the same sacred point. In the flat lands of southern Mesopotamia, such elevation mattered, A temple platform rose above flood, dust, and ordinary space. It was a mountain made by human hands in a land without mountains. There is a profound clue here to the Sumerian mind. The city did not merely contain a temple. In many ways, the temple gave the city its logic. Around the sacred center, storage could develop. Around storage, accounting. Around accounting, scribal practice. Around scribal practice, administration. Around administration, hierarchy. Around hierarchy, ideology. And around all of it, the claim that the gods had chosen this place, that the labor of human beings participated in a cosmic necessity. This does not mean that religion caused everything by itself. The fields mattered, the canals mattered, trade mattered, population mattered, technology mattered. Yet Eridu warns us against imagining ancient religion as something vague, private, or secondary. In the deep past, ritual could organize bodies, shape space, direct surplus, and preserve memory. It could make people return. It could make them build. It could make one location more important than another across centuries. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the names of the earliest builders. We do not know the exact words spoken in these first shrines. We do not know whether the people of the lowest levels would recognize the later myths told about their city. The first ceremonies have vanished. The first offerings are only traces. The first fears and hopes have passed beyond recovery. Yet the layers remain, and the layers say something no single myth could prove on its own. They say that sacred architecture in southern Mesopotamia has immense depth. They say that long before the written city fully announced itself, people were already shaping space around divine presence. They say that the roots of Sumerian civilization reached down through temple floors into a world where ritual, water, memory, and community were already bound together. Eridu does not solve the mystery of Sumer. It deepens it. It shows that the first cities did not emerge from a spiritual emptiness. They grew from places already thick with meaning. Beneath the later world of kings, scribes, and tablets lay older foundations, where human beings stood in dim rooms of mud brick and offered the products of field, marsh, and hand to powers they believed held the order of existence. There, in the layered temple of Eridu, one can almost feel the beginning of the Sumerian answer. Civilization was not only built to feed the body, it was built to steady the world. In the oldest imagination of Sumer, cities were not merely built. They were founded. That distinction is everything. To build is to raise walls, cut canals, stack bricks, measure fields, and gather workers beneath the sun. To found is to establish meaning, to plant a settlement inside the order of the universe, to say that this place, this temple, this gate, this storehouse, this sacred enclosure, this patch of mud beside a river, has been chosen and named and woven into the designs of powers greater than humankind. The Sumerians did not look upon the city as a human accident. They looked upon it as a divine arrangement. Their texts speak of gods who owned cities, gods who loved cities, gods who abandoned cities, gods who received offerings from cities, gods whose temples formed the burning centre of civic life. A city was not simply a dense settlement. It was a divine household enlarged until it became a world. Its fields fed the god. Its workers served the god. Its storehouses preserved the god's wealth. Its festivals renewed the bond between the human community and the unseen order. This vision is difficult for a modern mind to inhabit, because modern people are trained to separate what the Sumerians held together. Religion here, economics there, politics in another chamber, administration in another office. But in Sumer, the divisions blur until they nearly vanish. The god had land, the temple received grain, the priesthood managed labour, the scribe counted animals, the ruler built canals in the name of divine duty. A ration bowl could belong to an economy, but also to a sacred structure of obligation. A field boundary could be a matter of law, but also part of a god's estate, A festival could be prayer, public spectacle, redistribution, political theatre, and cosmic maintenance all at once. This is why the phrase kingship descended from heaven carried such force. It did not merely claim that rulers were powerful, it claimed that rule itself had a sacred source. Authority was not invented in a marketplace by clever men with sharp elbows. It came from above, from the unreachable level of divine decision. The city received kingship the way a field receives water, as a force that arrives, transforms, and demands careful handling. Yet gods in Sumer were not distant abstractions. They were personalities, powers, owners, patrons, forces of storm, sky, love, war, wisdom, fertility, justice, writing, grain, and the deep. They could bless and destroy. They could be pleased by offerings or angered by neglect. They had temples, servants, songs, statues, processions, and divine families. Their presence was not decorative. It structured reality. At the centre of this system stood the temple. A Sumerian temple was not a quiet hall visited only for private consolation. It was a living engine of the city. It stored food. It directed work. It gathered offerings. It employed specialists. It trained scribes. It received tribute. It owned herds. It supervised fields. It anchored festivals. It held divine images that were treated not as mere symbols, but as living presences requiring care, clothing, food, cleansing, and praise. The god had to be served. The city existed in part to serve. This may sound harsh, but it gave life a powerful structure. The daily labour of farmers, weavers, brewers, herders, fishermen, potters, builders, and boatmen could be understood as participation in a sacred economy. Work was not only survival, it was service to a cosmic household. The city's success showed divine favour. Its failure might reveal divine anger. Drought, defeat, epidemic, or flood were not simply events. They were messages, punishments, mysteries, or signs that something in the fragile bond between heaven and earth had broken. The temple therefore had to be beautiful, orderly, and supplied. Its walls were renewed, its platforms were raised, its rituals were repeated, its storerooms were filled, its songs were preserved. Its priests and officials maintained the proper forms because disorder in the temple might invite disorder in the world. In such a universe, neglect was dangerous. The gods had given order, but order had to be fed. This belief helps explain the immense energy poured into sacred architecture. On the flat southern plain, where natural heights were scarce, temple platforms rose like artificial mountains. They lifted the sacred above the dust, above the floodplain, above the ordinary movement of animals and carts and workers. The temple was not simply seen. It was approached. It commanded the body before the mind even began to understand it. To climb toward the god was to move from common space into charged space, from noise into ritual, from the horizontal world of fields and canals into a vertical relationship with heaven. The architecture taught theology without words. The city spread outward. The temple rose upward. The divine stood above and within. In the great precincts, sound would have mattered. Footsteps in courtyards, the low murmur of workers, the scratch of reed pens on clay, the voices of singers and lamentation priests, the movement of animals brought for offering, the slosh of beer jars, the grinding of grain, the chant of ritual language learned and repeated with precision. The city was not silent around its gods. It pulsed. Sumerian texts reveal God's founding, choosing and shaping cities. But archaeology reveals the human hands that made those claims real. Mud bricks had to be formed one by one, reeds cut, clay mixed, bitumen carried, offerings prepared, accounts maintained, fields cultivated, canals cleared. The divine foundation of the city required endless human labour. This is the paradox at the heart of Sumer. The city was said to come from the gods, yet it survived only through the work of mortals. Perhaps that is why the system was so powerful. It did not erase human effort. It gave human effort a cosmic frame. A worker hauling brick in the heat might be exhausted, exploited, hungry, or proud. But the brick was not meaningless. It belonged to a temple. The temple belonged to a god. The god belonged to the structure of the world. Even hardship could be absorbed into a story larger than the individual body. Of course, sacred stories also served power. To say that the gods founded cities could justify hierarchy. To say that a temple-owned land could sanctify control. To say that kingship descended from heaven could make rebellion appear not merely political, but cosmic. The sacred could console, but it could also command. It could bind communities together, but also bind labourers to institutions. Sumer's divine city was both shelter and burden, both meaning and mechanism. Still, to reduce it only to control would be another kind of blindness. The Sumerians were not fools tricked by their rulers into believing in gods. They lived in a world where river, sky, fertility, disease, death, and dream pressed constantly against the limits of explanation. They saw pattern and danger everywhere. They built temples because the world felt alive with powers. They sang hymns because beauty mattered. They made offerings because gratitude and fear are ancient companions. They imagined divine founders because cities seemed too important to be merely human. And perhaps they were right, in their own way, not because gods can be measured in an excavation trench, but because the idea of the god made the city possible. A purely practical settlement might feed bodies. A sacred city could organize generations. It could hold memory across centuries. It could make people rebuild on the same spot long after the first builders were dust. It could turn a mud brick into destiny. The Sumerian city was therefore a meeting place. Between canal and temple, between hunger and offering, between account and hymn, between human labour and divine order, between the measured world of barley rations and the immeasurable world of sacred fear. When the texts say that gods founded city, they are not simply telling a childish story about invisible builders. They are revealing how the earliest urban civilization understood its own necessity. A city needed walls, water, fields, craft, and administration. But it also needed a reason to exist. It needed a sacred centre strong enough to pull many lives into one body. And there, in the temple shadows, among jars of grain, polished stones, reed baskets, incense smoke, and clay tablets drying in the light, Sumer found that reason. The gods founded cities because mortals needed the world to make sense. Beneath the name of Sumer lies an older world. It is quieter, less famous, and harder to see, not because it was simple, but because it lived mostly beyond the reach of writing. Its people did not leave long royal inscriptions. They did not fill libraries with hymns and legal judgments. They did not preserve their names in king lists. Yet in the soil beneath later cities, in painted pottery, house plans, clay figurines, sickle blades, hearths, graves, and temple foundations, this older world still speaks in a language of fragments. This was the inheritance of the Ubaid. Long before the full blaze of Sumerian urban life, communities across southern Mesopotamia were already experimenting with settlement, farming, ritual, exchange, and social coordination. The Ubaid world was not a single kingdom. It was not an empire. It was a broad cultural horizon, a pattern of life spreading across regions, recognized by archaeologists through material culture, especially distinctive ceramics, architectural forms, and settlement remains. The word may sound technical, but behind it were real people. They rose in the morning beneath the same hard sky. They shaped clay vessels with practiced hands. They cut reeds. They planted fields. They herded animals. They fished in marsh waters. They buried their dead. They maintained houses of packed mud and brick. They gathered at buildings set apart from ordinary domestic life. They lived inside communities already learning how to remain in place for generations. The Ubaid inheritance matters because it breaks the illusion of suddenness. Sumer did not erupt from an empty marsh like a temple summoned by magic. Its foundations were laid by people whose lives stretched back through centuries of slow change. They created the habits that later made cities possible. They developed settlement patterns in the alluvial plain. They practiced irrigation in forms that would grow more elaborate with time. They built communal structures. They maintained exchange contacts. They cultivated the social memory of sacred places. In some Ubaid sites, buildings appear that seem to anticipate later temple architecture. They were not yet the massive platforms of the historic city. They did not yet dominate the landscape with the same authority, but they were already special. Their plans were more formal than ordinary houses. Their locations and repeated rebuilding suggest that some places carried significance beyond everyday shelter. Here again, one sees the long route of the Sumerian temple, not a sudden invention, but an intensification of older sacred habits. The old world was not static. Archaeology reveals change across time, though that change is uneven and often difficult to interpret. Villages grew. Some settlements became more important than others. Craft traditions became more recognizable. Pottery styles spread across wide areas, suggesting contact, shared taste, movement of people, or the circulation of ideas. Small objects travelled, raw materials moved. A community on the southern plain might hold goods whose origins lay far away in mountains or distant regions, already hinting at the networks that would later feed the first cities. This is one of the great lessons of prehistory. Before there were states, there were connections. Before there were kings boasting of foreign lands, there were traders, travellers, herders, fisherfolk, craftspeople, and families moving through landscapes with objects, stories, skills, and customs. The city did not invent exchange, it magnified it. The city did not invent ritual, it concentrated it. The city did not invent inequality, it sharpened and organized it. The city did not invent memory, it forced memory into durable form. The Ubaid world shows the slow gathering of these possibilities. Its houses speak of domestic order, its graves speak of social identity and care for the dead, its ceramics speak of shared forms and aesthetic choices, its tools speak of field, herd, marsh, and workshop. Its sacred buildings speak of collective attention. Its spread across regions speaks of cultural influence powerful enough to cross distance without armies. Yet this older world remains elusive, without written testimony. Its people cannot explain themselves in their own words. Their beliefs must be approached cautiously through architecture, figurines, burial treatment, and patterns of deposition. A clay figurine with strange eyes or an elongated body may feel like a messenger from a forgotten religion, but it does not come with a caption. A painted bowl may suggest taste, identity, trade, or ritual use, but its full meaning has vanished. A special building may be a shrine, a communal house, an elite residence, or something that does not fit modern categories. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. That phrase belongs to the deep places of history, and the Ubaid is one of those places. It is a world half illuminated by excavation and half concealed by silence. We see its outlines, but not its songs. We see its walls, but not the arguments inside them. We see its burials, but not the grief. We see its pottery, but not the names of the potters. We see its settlements, but not the stories told when children asked where their people came from. And yet the fragments are enough to change the question. The mystery is not how Sumer appeared from nowhere. The mystery is how many centuries of older life became compressed, intensified, and transformed until the urban threshold was crossed. The Ubaid inheritance reveals a southern Mesopotamia already prepared by experience. People knew the marshes, they knew clay, they knew farming in difficult lands, they knew communal construction, they knew exchange beyond the village, they knew that some buildings were different from others, and that certain places could gather meaning across generations. There may also have been social differences, though they were not yet the towering hierarchies of later kings and temple institutions. Some households may have controlled more resources. Some lineages may have held ritual authority. Some communities may have become nodes of influence. Inequality can begin softly, almost invisibly, through access, reputation, obligation, and control over knowledge. By the time the first cities rose, such patterns may already have been old. The Ubed world also teaches humility. It reminds us that written civilization stands upon unwritten lives. The glory of Sumer depends on people whose names were never recorded, whose languages are uncertain, whose gods may have changed form before they entered later texts. The first scribes did not create civilization from nothing. They inherited fields already known, canals already imagined, sacred spaces already revered, clay technologies already mastered, and regional networks already alive. In the deep soil, history becomes less like a birth and more like a river. A river gathers tributaries. A river changes course. A river carries sediments from places far away. By the time it reaches the plain, it may seem like a single body of water, but within it are countless hidden sources. So it was with Sumer. The Ubaid inheritance flowed beneath it. Older farmers, builders, potters, ritual leaders, fishers, herders, and traders created the habits of life from which the first urban civilization would draw strength. They did not know they were preparing the stage for history. They were simply living, adapting, remembering, and rebuilding. Yet their work endured, not in famous names, not in heroic poems, not in royal statues, but in the deep pattern of settlement, ritual, craft, and survival that made Sumer possible. The tablets may have given civilization its voice, but the Ubaid gave it roots. Uruk was not merely large. It was something new in the human story. A settlement can grow slowly, house by house, field by field, until one day the old word for village no longer fits. The paths become streets, the shrines become temple precincts, the storage rooms become institutions, the household craft becomes organized production, the local exchange becomes regional command, the crowd becomes a population, the mound becomes a city. At Uruk, this transformation reached a scale so astonishing that the ancient world itself seemed to change shape around it. Imagine approaching Uruk across the flat southern plain. The air shimmers, dust lifts beneath feet and hooves, canals cut lines through fields of barley, date palms mark patches of settlement and cultivation. Boats move slowly along waterways, carrying jars, reeds, grain, wool, fish, and people. In the distance, the city rises from the plain, not in stone towers like later mountain kingdoms, but in masses of mud brick, platforms, walls, courtyards, and temple buildings, shaped by countless hands under the relentless sun. Uruk was a city made from earth, but it was not humble. Its scale announced authority. Its sacred precincts gathered labour and imagination in ways the older village world could never have sustained. Monumental buildings rose within ceremonial spaces, some decorated with intricate clay cones pressed into walls to form coloured patterns. Temples and platforms did not simply provide rooms for ritual. They transformed space into power. They told every approaching body that this place was no ordinary settlement. Here, the world had a centre. Here, the gods were served. Here, the labour of thousands had been gathered and fixed into architecture. The growth of Uruk reveals the explosive moment when Sumer became visible as urban civilization. Population density changed everything. In a village, most people knew one another by face, kinship, reputation, or memory. In a city, strangers became part of the same system. Trust could no longer rest only on personal knowledge. Distribution could no longer rely only on custom. Work could no longer be coordinated only by household rhythm. The city required methods that exceeded the mind of any single person. So the city produced records. It produced seals. It produced measures. It produced officials. It produced categories of labour and goods. It produced trained hands that could press signs into clay and make a transaction endure beyond speech. Uruk's rise was tied to this new world of administration. The famous early tablets from the Uruk period show a society deeply concerned with counting, classifying, allocating, and controlling. They reveal not an idle people suddenly deciding to invent literature, but institutions wrestling with abundance. Grain had to be received, beer had to be distributed, textiles had to be tracked, animals had to be listed, workers had to be fed, offerings had to be supplied, fields had to be assessed, workshops had to be supported. The city was hungry, not only for food, but for information. Every complex institution must feed on knowledge of itself. It must know what it has, what it lacks, who works, who receives, who owes, who commands, who delivers, who fails. Uruk became a place where memory was no longer enough, and so the earliest writing emerged as a tool of management before it became a vessel of poetry and myth. This does not make Uruk less wondrous. It makes it more wondrous. There is something almost sacred in the first administrative mark, because it shows the human mind confronting scale. A herd is no longer simply seen, it is counted. A field is no longer simply walked, it is measured. A worker is no longer simply present, he or she is recorded. A jar of grain is no longer simply stored. It becomes part of a system of obligation, ration, and authority. The world is divided into signs so that it can be governed. Cylinder seals also belong to this transformation. Small, carved objects rolled across wet clay, leaving continuous images and marks of identity, authorization, and control. A sealed jar, door, basket, or document could show that someone had approved, protected, or claimed it. The seal allowed authority to travel. It made trust visible. It turned ownership and office into an impression that could survive the absence of the person who made it. In these small objects, one sees the city becoming abstract. Power no longer needed to stand physically beside every storehouse. It could be represented. A seal impression could speak for an official. A tablet could speak for a transaction. A ration list could speak for an institution. Clay became an extension of authority, and authority became portable, repeatable, and durable. Uruk also reshaped labour. The city needed builders, potters, weavers, brewers, herders, fishermen, scribes, priests, boatmen, canal workers, guards, and many others whose roles were increasingly specialised. Specialisation can create skill and beauty, but it also creates dependence. The potter depends upon grain grown by others. The scribe depends upon rations measured by an institution. The worker depends upon distribution. The temple depends upon fields. The ruler depends upon labour. In the city, everyone becomes entangled. The beveled rim bowl, one of the most recognisable artefacts of the Uruk world, captures this entanglement in humble form. These mass-produced clay bowls appear in huge numbers. They are rough, standardised, quickly made, and often associated with rationing. Perhaps they held grain, bread, or prepared food. Their exact use remains debated, but their abundance suggests a society distributing measured portions to many people. They are not glamorous objects. They do not glitter. They do not display royal vanity. Yet they may tell us more about the rise of Uruk than gold ever could. 1,000 bowls mean 1,000 mouths. 1,000 mouths mean organised labour. Organised labour means institutions capable of gathering, feeding, and directing people beyond the scale of kinship. The city was therefore both marvel and machine. Its temples lifted human imagination toward the divine, while its storerooms tied human bodies to measured rations. Its ceremonies created shared meaning, while its officials recorded obligation. Its walls and precincts promised order, while its growth produced inequality, dependency, and control. Uruk was not a simple triumph. It was a transformation, radiant and dangerous. Still, One must not imagine its people as faceless parts inside a system. They laughed in courtyards. They worried over children. They cursed difficult work. They listened to stories in the evening. They watched boats arrive from distant places. They smelled brewing beer and baking bread. They heard animals in pens, hammers in workshops, voices in markets, chants from sacred spaces, and the scrape of reed styluses in administrative rooms. They lived not in an abstraction called urbanism, but in days filled with heat, dust, hunger, ritual, fatigue, pleasure, fear, and hope. Uruk's explosive rise also sent influence outward. Its styles, seals, administrative practices, and material culture spread far beyond the southern plain. In distant regions, archaeologists have found traces of Uruk contact, sometimes in trading enclaves, sometimes in local imitations, sometimes in objects that show southern Mesopotamia reaching into wider networks. The city did not simply grow inward, it projected itself across space. It needed materials the alluvial plain lacked: timber, stone, metals, and other goods had to come from elsewhere. Thus, the first city was also a node in a world of movement. The paradox of Uruk is that its foundations were local, but its appetite was regional and beyond. A city built of mud needed mountains. A land without much stone needed distant quarries. A plain poor in metal needed far horizons. The rise of Uruk was therefore never only a southern story. It drew together marsh, field, desert edge, mountain route, and river corridor. The city became a magnet, pulling resources and people into its orbit, then sending forms of power and culture back out. And yet, for all its scale, Uruk remains partly veiled. The earliest writing is difficult and limited. Many buildings are damaged. Later occupation disturbed older levels. The voices of common people are faint. The exact mechanisms of political authority remain debated. Was the temple supreme where emerging rulers already separating themselves from priestly institutions? How did households relate to public power? How voluntary was labour? How sacred was administration? How coercive was distribution? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. But one truth rises clearly from the clay and brick. Uruk was the moment when the village world was no longer enough. It gathered the older inheritance of southern Mesopotamia and intensified it, until a new form of life appeared. The city became a container for gods and grain, for labour and memory, for ambition and fear. It created writing not out of leisure, but out of necessity. It turned mud into monuments and records into power. It made human society visible at a scale that had never existed before. Uruk was where Sumer stepped fully into history, not quietly, not gently, but with the roar of a city learning to remember itself. Power in Sumer did not begin with a crown. It began with grain. A field ripened beneath the sun. Workers cut barley with sickles. Bundles were carried, threshed, measured, stored, and redistributed. What looked like food was also time, labour, obligation, status, and survival. A jar filled with barley was not merely a jar. It was a promise that someone could work tomorrow. It was a wage. It was a tax. It was an offering. It was the difference between order and hunger. In the first cities, grain became the language through which society measured itself. Barley could be counted. Barley could be stored. Barley could be moved from field to temple, from temple to worker, from worker to household, from household back into obligation. It could become bread. It could become beer. It could feed animals. It could sustain labour gangs, digging canals, raising platforms, hauling bricks, and maintaining the difficult machinery of the city. Grain was life made measurable, and once life could be measured, it could be governed. This is the uncomfortable brilliance of Sumer. The early tablets reveal not only a people discovering writing, but institutions discovering control. The marks pressed into clay were tools of memory, yet memory is never innocent when it belongs to power. To record a ration is to preserve a duty. To list a worker is to bind a name to an expectation. To count animals is to make their movement answerable. To seal a jar is to declare that what lies inside belongs within a chain of authority. Clay, grain, and power became inseparable. The clay tablet was humble in form, but immense in consequence. It could sit in the palm of a hand, yet hold a relationship between people who might not trust one another, might not know one another, might never meet face to face. A scribe could record a delivery. An official could authorize distribution. A seal could protect a storage room. A tablet could be checked against a later tablet. Mistakes could be challenged. Fraud could be exposed. Debts could survive beyond the memory of witnesses. Here was a new force in the world. Accountability, but also surveillance. The first written records did not simply liberate memory from the mind. They placed memory inside institutions. A human being could forget, forgive, die, or be persuaded. A tablet could remain cold, silent, and stubborn. It could be stored on a shelf. It could be brought out when needed. It could make the past return as evidence. That ability changed society. In small communities, obligation can be remembered through kinship, gossip, reputation, and face-to-face exchange. In a city, those older forms strain under the weight of numbers. A temple household might manage fields scattered across a wide district. It might employ workers from many families. It might receive goods from far away. It might distribute rations according to rank, role, gender, age, task, season, or ritual need. It might own sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys, boats, workshops, storage rooms, and land. Such a system could not rely only on memory. It needed scribes. The scribe was one of the most important figures in the Sumerian transformation. Not necessarily the most powerful at first, not always the wealthiest, not always the most visible in monuments, but essential. The scribe stood at the doorway between speech and record. He learned signs, numbers, measures, categories, and formulas. He transformed a living event into a durable object. He made a transaction portable across time. One can imagine the training. The young hand struggling with damp clay, the repeated signs, the lists of commodities, the measures of grain, the names of professions, the discipline of copying, the correction of errors, the aching fingers, the hardening of a mental world in which everything could be sorted, named, counted, and compared. Scribal education did not simply teach writing, it taught a way of seeing. The world became legible through categories that served institutions. In this sense, the tablet was not a mirror of Sumerian society. It helped create Sumerian society. Once a category exists in writing, it can be administered more efficiently. Once a measure is standardized, goods can move through a larger system. Once a ration can be recorded, labor can be organized in repeating patterns. Once a seal can mark authority, distant officials can act in the name of a center. Once names can be stored, hierarchy becomes more durable. Power becomes less dependent on presence. A ruler or temple official cannot stand in every field, storehouse, and workshop. But his command can travel through sealed clay. His administration can reach places where his body is absent. The impression of a cylinder seal, the tablet in a basket, the token in an envelope, the mark beside a quantity of grain. All of these are small fragments of delegated power. This is how cities extend themselves, not only with roads and canals, but with records. The temple economy was especially important in this development. Temples controlled resources, directed labor, and served as focal points for production and distribution. Their authority was sacred, but their operations were intensely practical. A god's household had to be fed, clothed, maintained, and honored. The human servants of that household also had to be fed. Offerings had to be prepared. Festivals had to be supplied. Buildings had to be repaired. Fields had to be worked. Animals had to be bred, counted, and allocated. The sacred demanded logistics, and logistics demanded writing. It is tempting to imagine religion as vapor, something spiritual and weightless. In Sumer, religion had mass. It filled granaries. It occupied land. It consumed labour. It required beer, bread, oil, wool, fish, dates, and animals. It needed doorways, storerooms, courtyards, kitchens, workshops, priests, singers, cleaners, herders, brewers, and scribes. The divine household was an economic organism, but the palaces too would grow in importance. As Sumerian cities developed, political authority became more visible in rulers who built walls, waged war, commissioned inscriptions, and claimed divine favour for their deeds. The relationship between temple and palace was not always simple. At times they cooperated, at times they competed, at times their powers overlapped so deeply that separating them becomes a modern convenience more than an ancient reality. Both depended upon surplus, both required labour, both used ideology. Both needed records. The economy of early Sumer was not a free marketplace in the modern sense, nor was it a single rigid machine controlled from one room. It was a complex mixture of temple households, palace authority, family production, private exchange, institutional redistribution, craft specialization, and long-distance trade. Silver could be weighed, barley could be rationed, wool could be processed in enormous quantities, merchants could travel, workers could serve institutions, households could pursue their own interests within larger structures of obligation. This complexity is part of the reason Sumer remains so fascinating. Its tablets do not show a simple world, they show a dense one. There are supervisors, labourers, herders, weavers, brewers, boatmen, potters, guards, gardeners, musicians, priests, scribes, and officials. There are women working in textile production, sometimes in large organised groups. There are children recorded in institutional contexts. There are animals tracked by age and sex. There are fields assessed for yield. There are offerings measured with care. There are punishments, contracts, loans, sales, adoptions, marriages, and disputes in later records. The city made life documentable, yet documentation was uneven. The people most visible in tablets are often those tied to institutions. Those outside the written machinery appear faintly, if at all. A shepherd becomes visible when sheep belong to an institution. A woman becomes visible when her labour enters a ration list or legal document. A field becomes visible when it's measured, taxed, transferred, or disputed. Writing illuminates what power needed to know. That is why the archive must be read with caution. It tells us much about administration, but less about private feeling. It preserves categories, but not always experience. It records workers, but rarely their inner worlds. It shows distribution, but not whether recipients felt gratitude, resentment, fear, or resignation. Behind every neat line of accounting lay bodies under heat, backs bent in fields, hands red from fibre, eyes tired from dust, mouths waiting for beer and bread. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden, but the tablets are enough to reveal that Sumer's sudden appearance was the appearance of organised power made visible in clay. The city did not only rise because people gathered together, people had gathered before. The city rose because gathering was managed, measured, justified, and remembered. A system formed in which grain moved through institutions, clay preserved obligations, and authority learned to survive beyond the voice. This was the great transformation. Power became administrative. It did not abandon violence, charisma, ritual, or lineage, but it acquired a new body made of records. The stroke of the stylus joined the command of the ruler and the offering of the priest. The storehouse became as important as the battlefield. The ration list became as revealing as the royal inscription. The seal impression became a quiet emblem of control. In the end, the Sumerian city was built not only from bricks, but from counted things. Counted grain, counted sheep, counted jars, counted workers, counted days. counted fields, counted offerings. To count is to bring the world under a form of order. To write the count is to make that order endure. And to control what is counted is to stand near the hidden machinery of civilization. The gods may have founded cities in the Sumerian imagination, but clay and grain taught those cities how to rule. The Sumerians spoke a language that stands apart. That single fact has troubled the study of ancient Mesopotamia for generations. In a land where peoples, gods, merchants, soldiers, farmers, and scribes moved through shifting worlds of contact, conquest, marriage, trade, and migration, the Sumerian language appears like an island rising from a dark sea. It is not Semitic like Akkadian. It is not clearly related to the great language families known from surrounding regions. It does not yield its ancestry easily. It survives in clay with remarkable power, yet its deeper origins remain hidden. Here the mystery sharpens. Who were the Sumerians? Were they descendants of older communities who had long lived in the southern alluvial plain, gradually forming a distinct language and identity across centuries of settlement? Were they newcomers from another land, entering the marshes and fields of the south with traditions that blended into the older Ubaid world? Were they one group among many, whose language became dominant because it became attached to temples, scribal schools, and the first cities? Or does the question itself mislead us, as though a civilization must belong to a single people with a single origin and a single moment of arrival? The ancient world was rarely so neat. Southern Mesopotamia was a place of movement. Rivers carried boats, canals connected settlements, marshes offered food and refuge. Trade routes reached toward the mountains, the Gulf, the Iranian plateau, Anatolia, the Levant, and lands still farther away. Stone, timber, metals, precious materials, shells, and ideas moved into a region poor in many raw resources but rich in agricultural and institutional power. Such a landscape did not produce sealed populations. It produced contact, and contact leaves complicated traces. A pot form may travel without people. A word may travel without conquest. A god may cross a border and receive a new name. A sealed design may be copied by a local craftsman who never saw the city where it began. A marriage may join two communities without altering the language of either. A merchant may bring stories, weights, songs, diseases, and habits of dress. A captive may become part of a household. A worker may migrate toward a temple economy in search of food. A herder may move seasonally between ecological zones. Identity, in such a world, was layered. The Sumerian language remains the most dramatic clue because it does not fit easily. Akkadian, spoken by Semitic peoples in Mesopotamia, can be placed within a broader family. Sumerian cannot. This isolation has inspired many theories, some careful, some reckless. Scholars have compared it with languages from distant regions. They have suggested mountain origins, eastern origins, northern origins, and local development. None of these proposals has settled the matter. The language keeps its own counsel, but language is not the same as blood. A population can change language without changing its ancestry completely. A ruling class can adopt the tongue of scribes. A sacred language can outlive the people who first spoke it. A city can contain many speech communities, some written, some never recorded. The language preserved in tablets may represent the language of administration, ritual, and schooling more clearly than the full soundscape of streets, fields, and marshes. The spoken world of Sumer must have been far richer than the written archive suggests. Imagine a market near a canal, crowded under the glare of afternoon. A boat has arrived with goods from upriver. A herder argues over animals. A temple agent inspects jars. A woman sells fish. A potter delivers vessels. A foreign trader struggles with local terms. Children run between reed baskets. Workers from nearby villages speak in accents unfamiliar to city officials. An Akkadian speaker bargains with a Sumerian speaker. Loan words pass from mouth to mouth. Gestures complete what grammar cannot. The city would have sounded like contact. Yet the clay tablets preserve the voice that institutions chose to train and transmit. Sumerian became the language of some of the oldest written records, and later it became something even more enduring, a language of learned tradition. Long after Sumerian may have faded as a daily spoken tongue, scribes continued to copy it, study it, gloss it, translate it, and honour it. It became the language of antiquity inside antiquity itself. That is one of the most fascinating transformations in human history. A language born in early cities became a scholarly treasure for later civilizations. Students copied Sumerian compositions even when Akkadian dominated speech and political life. Priests and scribes preserved hymns, myths, lexical lists, incantations, and royal traditions. Sumerian became old, sacred, prestigious, and difficult. It became a key to the deep past. In that sense, the Sumerians became ancestors not only through blood, but through education. Genomic data has begun to transform the study of ancient populations across the world. But Mesopotamia presents difficulties. Preservation is uneven. Heat, soil conditions, water, disturbance, and long occupation all complicate the recovery of ancient DNA. Modern genetic studies can illuminate broad patterns of ancestry, mobility, and mixture. Yet they cannot simply point to a skeleton and say, "This is the origin of Sumer," even when DNA is recovered. Linking genes to language and culture requires caution. People move, languages spread, identities shift. Material culture changes hands. The past refuses simple equations. A poet is not a people, a language is not a genome, a city is not a tribe. This is why the phrase strangers in the south must be handled carefully. It may be that some ancestors of Sumerian speakers arrived from elsewhere. It may be that Sumerian developed locally from languages spoken by earlier communities whose other branches vanished without record. It may be that multiple groups blended in the lowlands until a distinctive urban culture emerged. It may be that the very act of city formation created the people later remembered as Sumerians. Civilizations often create identities as much as identities create civilizations. A person living in a small village may know clan, household, field, shrine, and neighbour. A person living within a city-state may begin to imagine belonging in wider terms. The temple god, the city name, the ruler, the festival calendar, the scribal tradition, the shared myths and enemies. All of these help create a people. Sumerian identity may not have existed fully formed before the cities. It may have crystallized through them. Still, one cannot ignore the sense of distinctiveness. The Sumerians knew they were not the same as every neighbour. Their language marked them. Their scribal tradition preserved them. Their city gods gave them local loyalties. Their myths placed their institutions within sacred time. Yet they lived alongside Akkadian speakers and other peoples for centuries, not as isolated ghosts, but as participants in a dense Mesopotamian world. Conflict existed, blending existed, borrowing existed, rivalry existed. The civilization of the South was never pure in the way later imaginations sometimes desire. Purity is usually a fantasy imposed upon the past. The ancient world was made of mixtures. The more closely we look, the more the clean lines blur. A Sumerian city could contain foreign goods. A Semitic name could appear in a Sumerian context. A Sumerian god could be worshipped by non-Sumerian speakers. An Akkadian ruler could claim inheritance from Sumerian kingship. A scribe could move between languages with professional skill. Cultural prestige could survive political defeat. In such a world, identity was not a wall. It was a woven reed mat, strong because many strands crossed one another. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we stand before the Sumerian language and feel the old question pull at us. Where did it come from? Perhaps from the marshes, perhaps from the north, perhaps from the east, perhaps from some vanished speech community whose homeland has left no inscription, no monument, no final proof. Perhaps the better question is not where did the Sumerians come from, but how did so many older streams of life gather in the south until one of them found a written voice? The tablets reveal a people who named their gods, counted their grain, praised their cities, mourned destruction, argued in courts, trained scribes, and imagined kings before the flood. Archaeology reveals deeper continuities beneath them. Environmental study reveals a demanding land that rewarded cooperation. Genomic research, where possible, reveals mixture and movement rather than sealed origins. Linguistics reveals a language alone, not because its speakers were alone, but because its relatives, if they existed, did not survive in written form. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The first Sumerian lullaby is gone. The earliest homeland stories are gone. The accents of workers in the fields are gone. The names by which neighbouring peoples first recognized them are gone. What remains is clay, structure, comparison, and the strange survival of a language that outlived the ordinary speech of its own people. The Sumerians were strangers in the south, only if one imagines the south as a place of fixed boundaries. In truth, they were children of a moving world, river world, marsh world, trade world, temple world, city world, a world where people arrived, adapted, blended, remembered, and transformed one another beneath the immense sky of Mesopotamia. Their origin is not a single doorway. It is a delta, many channels, many silences, one civilization rising where the waters met. The land of Sumer was a gift of rivers, but every gift carried a threat. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not behave like obedient servants. They shifted, flooded, abandoned channels, cut new paths through the plain, and laid down silt in ways that could nourish a field one generation and ruin it in another. The people who lived between them were never simply farmers in a quiet valley. They were negotiators with moving water, inhabitants of a landscape that had to be read, managed, feared, and continually repaired. Civilization here was not born in comfort. It was born in tension. Too little water, and the fields failed. Too much water, and houses dissolved back into mud. A flood could bring rich silt, but it could also tear open canals, drown animals, destroy stored grain, and leave disease in its wake. Irrigation could turn dry land fertile, but poor drainage could draw salt upward through the soil until fields slowly weakened. A canal that fed one city might deprive another. A river course that once gave life to a settlement might wander away, leaving docks, fields, and sacred precincts stranded in a changing plain. The Sumerians lived inside this uncertainty. Their world was not the neat blue line of a river on a modern map. It was a living system of channels, levees, marshes, backwaters, irrigation cuts, seasonal flows, ponds, and flood basins. Water moved through it like fate. It brought fish, reeds, clay, transport, fertility, and connection. It also brought ruin. To build in Sumer was to build with the knowledge that the land itself might one day betray the builder. This is why water entered myth so deeply. Flood stories in Mesopotamia are not decorative tales placed upon a harmless environment. They belong to a world in which water could erase human effort with terrifying speed. The memory of overwhelming flood, whether drawn from specific ancient events, repeated local disasters, or the general dread of river life, became one of the most powerful images in Sumerian and later Mesopotamian thought. Before the flood, a former age. After the flood, a changed world. Between them, the waters of chaos. But flood was only one face of environmental pressure. Drought mattered too, even in a land famous for rivers. The waters that reached southern Mesopotamia depended upon rainfall and snowmelt far away, in regions most Sumerian farmers would never see. A dry year upstream could become hunger downstream. The sky above Sumer might be clear and pitiless, while the fate of the fields had already been decided in distant mountains. This invisible dependence must have sharpened the sense that human life was tied to powers beyond local control. The fields required management with a discipline almost sacred in itself. Canals had to be dug, cleared, widened and repaired. Silt had to be removed, embankments had to be strengthened, water had to be timed and directed. Disputes had to be settled because one community's irrigation could become another community's deprivation. The work was heavy, repetitive, and communal. No single household could maintain the larger water system alone. The landscape demanded cooperation, and cooperation demanded organisation. Here, environment and authority met. The need to manage water did not automatically create kings, temples, or states, but it gave powerful advantages to institutions that could mobilise labour and settle conflict. A temple that commanded workers could clear canals. A ruler who organised irrigation could claim legitimacy. A city that controlled water could feed more people, support specialists, and dominate neighbours. The river did not simply nourish Sumer. It helped create the conditions under which administration, hierarchy, and sacred power could grow. The canal was therefore more than a ditch. It was a political fact. It marked decisions, it embodied labour, it carried wealth, it could be praised, fought over, neglected, repaired, celebrated and weaponized. To control a canal was to stand close to the source of life. To lose one was to watch a community wither. In later inscriptions, rulers often boasted of digging canals, restoring watercourses, and making fields abundant. Such claims were not empty ornament. They struck at the core responsibility of leadership in the southern plain. A king who brought water brought order. A king who failed invited famine and rebellion. Yet environmental management had consequences the Sumerians could not always master. Irrigation agriculture in arid lands can create salinization, especially when evaporation leaves salts behind in the soil. Over long periods, fields may become less productive. Barley, more salt-tolerant than wheat, came to dominate in southern Mesopotamia, and this agricultural reality shaped diet, economy, and labour. The city fed itself through a system that had to be maintained constantly, but the very system that sustained life could slowly burden the land. There is a tragic rhythm here. The more people gathered in cities, the more grain they needed. The more grain they needed, the more irrigation expanded. The more irrigation expanded, the more labour and oversight were required. The more oversight was required, the stronger institutions became. The stronger institutions became, the more people were drawn into their systems of ration, duty, and dependence. The environment did not force civilization into being by itself, but it pressed upon human society like a hand against wet clay, shaping possibilities, limiting choices, and rewarding certain forms of organization over others. The rivers also connected Sumer to the wider world. Boats moved along channels and waterways, carrying goods with an ease that heavy land transport could not match. The same waters that threatened fields allowed communication between cities and beyond them. Grain, wool, dates, fish, and craft goods could move outward. Timber, stone, metals, and luxury materials could move inward. The rivers made Sumer both vulnerable and outward-looking. They tied local survival to distant exchange. The marshes added another dimension. To outsiders, a marsh may seem like wasteland, but to those who know it, it is a world of abundance. Reeds for building and weaving, fish for food, birds and eggs, pigs, water plants, pasture zones, hiding places, boat routes. The marshes were not the opposite of civilization. They were part of the same ecological fabric. They provided resources that helped sustain settlement, and perhaps also spaces beyond full institutional control, places where people could flee, resist, fish, herd, and live according to older rhythms. Thus, Sumer was never only field and city. It was also wetland, reed bed, fish trap, boat path, and horizon of water. The sacred imagination of the Sumerians seems to have absorbed this watery reality. Deep waters, flood waters, river gods, purification, fertility, and cosmic origins all belong naturally to such a world. A people who watched land emerge from silt could imagine creation as ordering watery chaos. A people who built temples on platforms above the plain could understand height as safety, sanctity, and divine nearness. A people who survived through canal maintenance could see cosmic order not as a fixed condition, but as a task. Order had to be done again and again. A neglected canal, like a neglected ritual, could invite disaster. A broken embankment, like a broken oath, could unravel the community. The Sumerian obsession with proper procedure, measured offerings, repeated hymns, and careful accounting was not merely bureaucratic habit. It reflected life in a world where small failures could become enormous consequences. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot reconstruct every flood. We cannot chart every vanished channel with certainty. We cannot know how each generation explained a failed harvest or a shifting river. The sediments speak, but incompletely. The texts remember, but through theology and politics, the ruins mark human response, but not always human understanding. Yet the broad truth is clear. Sumer rose because people learned to live with unstable abundance. They did not conquer nature in any final sense. No ancient society ever did. They entered into a long argument with water, mud, salt, drought, flood, and distance. Their cities were answers written in brick and canal lines, but the questions kept returning. How to feed thousands? How to store surplus? How to appease divine powers? How to organize labor? How to survive when the river changed its mind? The Sumerian texts reveal gods, kings, offerings, and floods because those were the categories through which the people understood their world. Archaeology reveals canals, settlement shifts, grain systems, and environmental strain because those were the material realities beneath the sacred language. Together they show a civilization not appearing from nowhere, but rising where risk and fertility met in the same shining water. The rivers gave Sumer life. The rivers gave Sumer fear, and from that fear, measured, ritualized, organized, and pressed into clay. The first cities learned how fragile civilization truly was. A city is never only its walls, it is the people within them, and in Sumer those people lived in a world of deepening roles, widening obligations, and increasingly visible differences. The first cities did not gather humanity into equality. They gathered humanity into structure. Priests, workers, scribes, merchants, craftsmen, herders, brewers, weavers, soldiers, boatmen, farmers, builders, musicians, officials, servants, and rulers all moved through the same urban organism, but not with the same freedom, not with the same security, and not with the same closeness to power. The temple stood near the centre of this structure. Its authority was sacred, but its reach was practical. It needed fields cultivated, animals managed, grain stored, beer brewed, cloth woven, bricks made, canals cleared, offerings prepared, festivals organised, and records maintained. This created a society in which large numbers of people could be tied to institutions through work and ration. The temple did not only receive devotion, it directed human movement. A labourer might wake before sunrise, eat a simple meal, gather with others, and move under supervision toward a canal bank, a construction site, a field, or a storehouse. A woman assigned to textile work might spend long days twisting fibre, spinning thread, weaving cloth, or preparing wool within a workshop system that turned animal wealth into institutional wealth. A brewer might transform barley into beer, not as a luxury alone, but as a staple of payment, ritual, nourishment, and daily life. A fisherman might bring catches from marsh waters into a distribution network that fed workers and supplied offerings. A potter might produce jars, bowls, and storage vessels in quantities demanded by institutions that measured everything. Each task was ordinary. Together they formed civilization. Sumerian society was built through repeated labour, most of it anonymous. The names of kings survive more easily than the names of brickmakers, but the brickmakers raised the temples. The names of high officials can appear in archives, but the reed cutters supplied roofs, mats, baskets, fences, and boats. The scribes could record a ration of barley, but hands in fields had first made that barley possible. The city rested upon backs, shoulders, fingers, knees, and eyes worn by work. This is where the romance of early civilization must be handled with care. The rise of Sumer is magnificent, but magnificence often has a cost. Monumental buildings do not rise because everyone has spare time and equal enthusiasm. Canals are not cleared because mud is pleasant. Large institutions can feed and protect, but they can also command, discipline, extract, and confine. The same system that allowed food to be stored against uncertainty could bind workers to ration schedules. The same temple that gave meaning could also gather surplus from those who produced it. Yet this was not merely a world of oppression. It was a world of interdependence, hierarchy, ambition, skill, belief, and survival. A craftsman might take pride in a beautiful seal, a fine vessel, a well-made tool, or a carved inlay. A singer might know sacred songs that gave her a place in ritual life. A scribe, trained through discipline and repetition, could rise into administrative importance. A merchant might move between cities and foreign lands, returning with strange materials and stories from beyond the horizon. A farmer might depend on temple structures, but also on family, neighbours, seasonal knowledge, and ancestral fields. The city widened human possibility even as it narrowed certain freedoms. Within its streets and courtyards, specialization flourished. People became experts in things no small village could support at the same scale. Metal workers learned the behavior of copper and alloy. Potters produced vessels suited to storage, cooking, offering, transport, and ration. Seal cutters created tiny worlds of animals, heroes, gods, and symbols on stones small enough to hold between finger and thumb. Builders learned how to manage mud brick architecture at monumental scale. Boatmen understood currents, channels, cargo, and risk. Scribes mastered signs that could outlast the voice. Such specialization required a society capable of feeding specialists who did not grow all their own food. That meant surplus. Surplus required fields, water control, or storage, and authority. Authority required justification. Justification often came through the gods. At the top of the social order stood those closest to sacred and administrative power. Priests and temple officials guarded ritual knowledge, supervised offerings, and managed the estate of the divine household. Rulers emerged with military, judicial, and building roles, presenting themselves as protectors, shepherds, canal diggers, temple builders, and servants of the gods. High officials stood between command and execution, translating authority into schedules, accounts, deliveries, and labour assignments. The scribe occupied a special place in this hierarchy. He was not merely literate. He belonged to the machinery by which institutions knew themselves. In a world where most people could not read or write, the ability to shape clay signs was power. It allowed a person to count, classify, witness, authorize, preserve, and interpret. The scribe could make a worker visible to the institution, or reduce that worker to a quantity of grain owed, received, or withheld. The stylus was small, but it could carry the weight of command. There were also merchants, whose lives opened Sumer to distant landscapes. The southern plain lacked much that cities desired. Stone, timber, metals, and luxury materials had to travel. Merchants and agents moved through uncertain routes, following rivers, coasts, deserts, and mountain passes. Their work carried risk, but also opportunity. They connected the mud brick cities of Sumer to faraway worlds of cedar, copper, lapis-coloured stones, hard woods, and strange goods that made local elites shine with foreign distance. Trade did more than move objects. It moved ideas, a seal style, a weight standard, a mythic image, a technical habit, a religious symbol, or a word might travel with the goods. The city became porous. Its walls did not prevent the world from entering. Sumerian society was rooted in the alluvial plain, but its imagination widened through contact. At the lower levels of the hierarchy were workers whose lives are often glimpsed through ration lists. These records can be painfully dry, but they're among the most human documents ever made. A measured portion of barley, a quantity of beer, a category of labour, a group of women, a child, a supervisor, a task. Such tablets show that the city knew people as units of work and consumption. Yet behind every unit was a breathing life. Some people were dependent labourers. Some were enslaved. Some were captives taken in war, debtors, household servants, or persons born into limited status. Slavery in Sumer didn't always resemble later systems in every detail, but unfreedom existed. Human beings could be bought, sold, inherited, assigned, and controlled. The rise of civilization did not abolish vulnerability. It created new legal and institutional forms through which vulnerability could be managed and exploited. Women's lives were varied and cannot be reduced to a single condition. Some women worked in large institutional textile operations. Some held property. Some appeared in legal documents. Some served in temples. Some belonged to households under male authority. Elite women could exercise influence through family, religion, and property, while poorer women were often tied to hard labour and ration systems. The city gave some women formal visibility and records, but that visibility often came because institutions needed to count their work. Children too appear in the shadows of administration. They were heirs, dependents, workers in training, offerings of family continuity, and sometimes vulnerable bodies inside institutions. Childhood in Sumer was not the sealed, protected category that modern people imagine. Children learned early from the rhythms of labour, household obligation, and social rank. A child born into a scribal family might enter the difficult world of signs and copying. A child born into poverty might enter work before any dream of education could form. Walls also mattered. As cities became richer and rivalry sharpened, fortification became a fact of life. A wall is a promise and a confession. It promises protection. It confesses danger. It tells us that outside the city were threats serious enough to justify enormous labour. Raids, rival cities, shifting alliances, border disputes, and struggles over water and fields made defence increasingly important. The same society that built temples for gods built walls against men. The emergence of professional or semi-professional fighters belongs to this hardening world. Conflict between city-states could mobilize citizens, dependents, retainers, and specialists in violence. Weapons, helmets, shields, formations, and royal inscriptions begin to reveal an age in which war became part of political identity. Rulers gained prestige by victory. Cities celebrated triumphs and mourned defeats. Captives could become labour. Territory could shift. Canals and fields could be seized or destroyed. The urban world created wealth dense enough to defend and tempting enough to attack. And yet, even amid hierarchy and violence, the city produced belonging. Festivals gathered people into shared time. Processions moved through sacred spaces. Music, food, drink, offerings, and spectacle drew the community around its gods. The poor and the powerful might not stand in the same place, but they inhabited the same ritual calendar. The city god belonged to all, even if access to divine wealth was unequal. Shared myths gave people a common horizon of meaning. Laments for destroyed cities show that urban identity could become deeply emotional, almost personal, as if a city were a living being whose suffering could be mourned. This is the great complexity of Sumerian society. It was not a simple ladder from slave to king. It was a dense web of household, temple, palace, field, workshop, canal, market, wall and shrine. People belonged to families, professions, institutions, neighborhoods, cities, gods, and rulers. Their identities overlapped, their obligations competed, their lives were shaped by both intimate ties and impersonal systems. The first cities created a new kind of human being, one who lived inside structures too large to be fully seen from any single doorway. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The archives preserve assignments, disputes, and distributions, but not every joke, prayer, resentment, love, or private rebellion. We can see the structure, but not all the souls moving within it. We can name officers, but not the tired face of the woman leaving the weaving room at dusk. We can count workers, but not hear what they whispered by the canal. We can excavate walls, but not feel every fear that made them necessary. Yet enough remains to reveal that Sumer did not suddenly appear as an empty monument. It appeared as a society of people organized with unprecedented intensity. Priests guarded the sacred center. Workers fed the city with their bodies. Scribes made obligation endure. Merchants widened the world. Craftsmen gave form to skill. Rulers claimed the gods and commanded walls. And somewhere in the streets between temple shadow and city gate, ordinary people carried the true burden of civilization, day by day, ration by ration, brick by brick, until mud became history. Sumer did not vanish in a single night. No dark wave rolled across the plain and erased every city at once. No final trumpet sounded from the temples. No one standing on the walls of Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, or Eridu could have looked out over the dust and known with certainty that an age was ending. Civilizations usually change like rivers. The current shifts, a channel silts, a bank collapses, new water cuts through old ground. What once seemed central becomes stranded. What once seemed foreign becomes the new center of gravity. The transformation of Sumer was long, violent, creative, and incomplete. Its cities endured through rivalry, conquest, revival, and memory. They fought one another, they built walls, they sent armies into fields, they argued over borders, canals, and divine favor. They produced rulers who called themselves shepherds and servants of the gods, while also crushing enemies, seizing land, and displaying captives. The sacred city became a battlefield. The temple economy did not prevent war. The clay tablet did not soften ambition. Writing, administration, and religion gave civilization form, but they also gave conflict sharper tools. The city-states of Sumer were intensely alive, and that life included competition. Each city had its god, its traditions, its fields, its water rights, its ruling families, its temples, and its pride. A canal dispute could become a political crisis. A border stone could become a symbol of cosmic justice. A victory could be framed as divine judgment. A defeat could mean not only loss of land, but humiliation before the gods. The Sumerian city was never merely a cluster of houses. It was a sacred personality. And when sacred personalities collided, history burned. Warfare grew from the very success of urban life. Cities gathered wealth. Wealth required protection. Protection required armed force. Armed force created new forms of leadership. Leadership sought glory, tribute, and security. Rival cities became enemies not because civilization had failed, but because civilization had concentrated resources in places worth taking. Grain stores, fields, herds, canals, labourers, temples, and trade routes all became prizes in the struggle for survival and supremacy. The ruler changed in this world. He was not only a ritual figure, he became builder, judge, war leader, organizer of labour, protector of boundaries, and voice of the city's ambition. Royal inscriptions present him as chosen by the gods, beloved by the gods, commanded by the gods, and victorious through the gods. Yet behind the sacred language stood practical power. Soldiers had to be equipped. Walls had to be raised. Workers had to be mobilized. Conquered land had to be administered. Captives had to be assigned. Victory had to be turned into grain, labour, prestige, and memory. The palace rose beside the temple as a great force, not always against it, not always separate from it, but increasingly visible as an institution of command. The temple had ancient depth. The palace had royal urgency. Together and apart, they shaped the city. Their relationship could be cooperative, tense, overlapping, or fused through the person of the ruler. The divine household and the royal household both needed land, labour, stores, officials, and scribes. Both spoke the language of order. Both depended upon the same fragile river world. Then came the Akkadian transformation. From the north and central lands of Mesopotamia, Semitic speaking power rose with a new imperial ambition. Sargon of Akkad became one of the great names of the ancient world, remembered as a conqueror whose reach surpassed the older city-state pattern. Under Akkadian rule, the political map changed. The cities of Sumer were drawn into a broader imperial structure, tied to a kingdom that imagined power not merely as supremacy over neighbouring fields, but as dominion across lands, roots, peoples, and horizons. This did not mean the end of Sumerian culture. Conquest rarely erases everything it touches. More often, it rearranges. Sumerian cities continued to matter. Sumerian scribal traditions continued. Sumerian gods remained powerful. Sumerian language remained embedded in learning and ritual. Akkadian rulers adopted, honoured, used, and reshaped the prestige of the south. They did not simply replace Sumer, they inherited it, exploited it, and were transformed by it. This is one of the great ironies of history. A conquered culture can become the grammar of the conqueror's legitimacy. The Akkadian kings needed the old cities. They needed their temples, scribes, gods, and administrative skills. Imperial power may have marched with soldiers, but it governed through records. It may have proclaimed conquest, but it clothed itself in sacred tradition. The older Sumerian world became part of a wider Mesopotamian identity, one in which languages, gods, and political forms intertwined. Yet empire brought strain. A broad kingdom is not simply a larger city. It must hold distant regions together, move goods and orders across space, manage rebellion, reward loyalty, and suppress rivals. It must turn victory into stable administration. It must persuade local elites that obedience is wiser than revolt. It must feed soldiers and officials. It must maintain roads, waterways, outposts, and loyalties. It must appear favoured by the gods even when drought, famine, invasion, or rebellion suggests otherwise. No empire escapes the pressure of distance. The Akkadian world, like every human construction, had limits. Later tradition remembered its kings with awe, but also remembered collapse, environmental stress, political rebellion, frontier pressure, succession struggles, and the difficulty of controlling diverse regions all likely played their parts. The fall of Akkad became wrapped in literature, theology, and memory. The destruction of a capital could be understood not only as politics, but as divine judgment. When a great power fell, people searched for meaning in the ruins. And then Sumer rose again. The so-called Sumerian Renaissance under the third dynasty of Ur represents one of the most remarkable revivals of the ancient world. Ur became a centre of royal power, administration, monumental building, and scribal brilliance. Kings presented themselves as restorers of order. They built temples, standardized systems, issued laws, managed labour, and extended influence across much of Mesopotamia. The old Sumerian language shone with renewed prestige in royal inscriptions and scholarly tradition, even as the everyday linguistic reality of the land was increasingly mixed. This revival was not a return to an untouched past. No restoration ever is. It was a new creation using ancient materials, Ur's rulers drew upon Sumerian sacred memory, city traditions, administrative genius, and temple ideology. But they governed in a world already changed by Akkadian imperial models, wider trade, militarized politics, and centuries of social transformation. They did not resurrect the earlier Sumer. They made a last grand synthesis, a brilliant late flowering of the southern tradition. The ziggurat of Ur stands in imagination as a symbol of that age, a great stage platform rising from the plain, built of mud brick, dedicated to the divine, proclaiming royal devotion and urban strength. Such architecture was not only religious, it was political memory in brick. It told subjects, enemies, priests, workers, and gods that the king had gathered labour, wealth, and cosmic legitimacy into a single form. It rose above the city like a mountain made from obedience and belief, but even Ur could not make time stand still. The pressures returned, frontiers shifted, Amorite groups and other peoples moved within the Mesopotamian world. Elamite forces from the east became part of the final crisis. Internal burdens weighed heavily. The administration of Ur was vast and detailed, but detail can be both strength and fragility. A system that counts everything must also feed everything, command everything, and defend everything. Records multiply when control is intense, but records cannot stop famine, invasion, or political unravelling by themselves. When Ur fell, it did not mean that every Sumerian tradition died in the ashes. The political independence of the old Sumerian world faded, but its cultural life endured with astonishing force. Sumerian continued in scribal schools, myths were copied, hymns were preserved, lexical lists trained students, laments mourned destroyed cities in language so powerful that grief itself became a literary art. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian scholars looked back to Sumer as a deep source of wisdom, antiquity, and prestige. The end of Sumer was therefore not an extinction. It was a transformation into memory. The spoken language retreated and eventually disappeared from daily life, but it lived on in scholarship and ritual. The city-states lost independence, but their gods entered wider pantheons. The first writing system evolved and adapted to other languages. The myths travelled. The flood story found new forms. The idea of sacred kingship continued. The administrative habits of counting, sealing, gyomyas, measuring, and recording became part of the inherited machinery of states. What collapsed was one political world. What survived was a civilizational foundation. This is why the story of Sumer cannot be told as a simple rise and fall. It is not a tower built, admired, and shattered. It is more like an ancient bed of embers. At times the flame burned high, in Uruk, in Lagash, in Akkad's conquered south, in Ur's final brilliance. At times it sank low, covered by the ash of conquest and change. Yet again and again, later people stirred those embers and found heat still glowing. The Sumerians themselves understood the terror of fallen cities. Their laments speak as though a city could be abandoned by its god, as though temples could become desolate, streets emptied, gates broken, songs silenced, and people scattered like chaff. These were not abstract poems. They emerged from a world that had seen destruction. The fall of a city meant the collapse of the ordered universe for those who belonged to it. When the god departed, the walls were only brick. When the temple was silent, the city's soul had fled, answerless, adrift to ponder. We stand among these transitions and feel the fragility beneath every monument. Sumer's greatness did not save it from war. Its gods did not prevent conquest. Its scribes did not halt environmental strain. Its kings did not master every frontier. Its canals did not remain forever obedient. Its language did not remain forever spoken. And yet, somehow, Sumer endured by changing form. It became the ancient past of later ancient peoples. It became a school language, a sacred language, a library of myths, a memory of first cities, a foundation beneath empires that scarcely resembled the old marshland city-states. Its tablets travelled through time because generations kept copying them. Its gods survived through translation and transformation. Its kings became legendary. Its flood became universal memory. Its mud brick cities crumbled. But the idea of the city remained. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, what buried archives remain beneath dust, what broken tablets may still alter the map of early history, what environmental clues may sharpen the story of drought, salinity, flood, and movement. But one truth is already visible. Sumer did not suddenly disappear, just as it did not suddenly appear from nowhere. It passed through conquest, revival, collapse, and inheritance. It became Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, scholarly, sacred, legendary, and archaeological. Its world ended many times, but its memory refused to die. The first cities fell. The first voice remained. What remains of Sumer? Not the sound of its streets, not the full music of its temples, not the smell of bread ovens at dawn, or the voices of children running through alleys of packed earth, or the hands of workers rinsing mud from their arms beside a canal. The living world has gone. The cities that once rose from the southern plain have fallen back into dust, and the rivers that sustained them have wandered through centuries of change. Yet Sumer remains. It remains in clay. It remains in signs. It remains in the idea that human life can be organized beyond the village, beyond the family, beyond the memory of any single person. It remains in the strange courage of building cities in a land that could flood, parch, salt, and shift beneath the feet of those who loved it. It remains in the belief that order must be made, guarded, renewed, and recorded, because chaos is never far away. The Sumerian texts do not reveal a simple answer to why Sumer appeared. They reveal something far more interesting. They reveal that civilization was never one invention. It was a convergence: water, mud, grain, temples, labor, memory, fear, trade, accounting, ritual, ambition, and myth all met in the southern plain. The city was not born from agriculture alone, nor from religion alone, nor from kingship alone, nor from commerce alone. It came from pressure. It came from necessity. It came from human beings learning that survival at scale required new forms of trust, new forms of control, and new stories powerful enough to hold thousands of lives together. The oldest tablets speak first in numbers and accounts, and that fact is almost unsettling. We might wish the first written words of humanity were grand declarations of love, wisdom, or cosmic wonder. Instead, they concern grain, livestock, labour, rations, and offerings. But perhaps that is more honest. Civilization begins not in abstraction, but in hunger, in the need to feed workers, store harvests, count animals, organize fields, and remember obligations. The sacred hymn and the heroic epic would come, but first the city had to eat, and yet even the rationalist has mystery within it. A line of accounting is never only a line of accounting. It is evidence of bodies gathered under authority. It is the shadow of a worker receiving bread or beer. It is the trace of a temple household reaching into the lives of ordinary people. It is proof that memory had moved outside the human mind and into matter. Once that happened, history changed forever. The clay tablet made the absent present. The dead could speak. The past could accuse. The city could remember. This is why Sumer matters so deeply. It was not simply first in a list of achievements, first writing, first cities, first law codes in embryo, first bureaucracies, first recorded myths, first great schools of scribes. These phrases are true enough, but they can make Sumer sound like a museum case filled with inventions. Its real importance is more intimate. Sumer shows the moment when human society became conscious of itself through record, ritual, and urban form. The Sumerians looked at their cities and saw more than mud brick. They saw divine order, They believed kingship descended from heaven. They believed gods founded cities, guarded temples, demanded offerings, and withdrew favour when order failed. They remembered floods that separated ages. They preserved kings who ruled for impossible years, not because they were confused children of history, but because they understood that origins live partly in myth. For them, the beginning of civilization was not merely a technical event, it was a sacred drama. Modern archaeology reads the same world through different instruments. Stratigraphic excavation reveals long sequences of occupation, radiocarbon dating anchors layers in time, lithic analysis and ceramic study trace habits of production and exchange, environmental research reconstructs shifting rivers, salinity, marshes, floods, droughts, and changing settlement patterns, genomic data, where preservation allows, hints at movement and mixture. Linguistics stands before the Sumerian language and finds an isolate, a voice with no certain family, still haunting the margins of knowledge. The ancient texts say the gods gave civilization. The earth says generations built it. Both truths matter, because one explains meaning and the other explains process. Human beings do not live by process alone. They need stories that make suffering intelligible. A canal worker, a weaver, a brewer, a scribe, a potter, a shepherd, a priest, a merchant, a king. All of them lived beneath a sky filled with uncertainty. The river might fail, the fields might weaken, enemies might come, a child might die, a city might fall, the gods might be silent. In such a world, ritual did not decorate life. It steadied it. Sumer's deepest legacy may be this recognition that civilization is not the opposite of fragility. Civilization is a response to fragility. Walls rise because danger exists. Granaries fill because hunger exists. Laws form because conflict exists. Temples stand because fear and wonder exist. Writing begins because memory fails. Kingship claims heaven because earthly power is never secure. The first cities were not monuments to certainty. They were monuments to human beings trying to survive uncertainty together. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Somewhere beneath the dust may lie tablets never read, shrines never uncovered, names never spoken in the modern world. Some questions may never be answered. We may never know the first homeland of the Sumerian language. We may never hear the earlier songs of Eridu. We may never know what an ordinary worker truly thought while carrying bricks toward a temple platform in the heat. We may never recover the private grief behind the public archive. But the silence is not empty. It is full of presence. Every broken tablet, every rebuilt temple floor, every seal impression, every canal trace, every clay bowl, every buried wall tells us that the people of Sumer were not shadows waiting for history to begin. They were history beginning. They were intelligent, anxious, creative, devout, ambitious, practical, and poetic. They were not primitive versions of us. They were themselves, complete within their own world, standing at the edge of a transformation whose consequences they could not possibly have imagined. From their mud brick cities came habits that still surround us. The written receipt, the recorded debt, the measured field, the school exercise, the legal witness, the city as sacred and political centre, the ruler as guardian of order, the state as keeper of memory, the archive as power. We live far from Sumer, and yet not far at all. Every time a name is written so it will not be forgotten. Every time a city organises the labour of strangers. Every time a government counts its people and stores its records. Every time human beings build meaning into brick, glass, stone, or clay. Sumer is somewhere beneath the floor. The first voice of history did not tell us everything. It could not, but it told us enough to know that civilization was never inevitable. It was made, it was chosen, endured, imposed, believed, feared, and rebuilt. It rose from mud and water, from ritual and ration, from gods and mortals walking the earth together in the imagination of those who first pressed signs into clay. And now, 5,000 years later, we sit beneath another sky, surrounded by cities beyond anything the Sumerians could have known, still asking their oldest questions. How do we make order? What do we owe the dead? What must be remembered? What happens when the river changes course? Answerless, adrift to ponder. We look back towards Sumer and see not an ending, but a beginning that never truly ceased. The clay remains. The signs remain. The question remains, and only time will tell what future discoveries will be made.